The Hidden Side of Things. By Charles Webster Leadbeater. First section. Introductory. How do you find this book? Any thoughts about the book or the author? Any suggestion for improvement? Please take a moment to share your thoughts in a comment. If you like it, share it with your friends who might enjoy it as well. Subscribe to keep in touch. Visit CompleteAudiobooks.com for more quality content. Chapter 1. Occultism. The term occultism is one which has been much misunderstood. In the mind of the ignorant it was, even recently, synonymous with magic, and its students were supposed to be practitioners of the black art, veiled in flowing robes of scarlet covered with Kabbalistic signs. Sitting amidst uncanny surroundings with a black cat as a familiar, compounding unholy decoctions by the aid of satanic evocations. Even now, and among those whom education has raised above such superstition as this, there still remains a good deal of misapprehension. For them its derivation from the Latin word occultus ought to explain at once that it is the science of the hidden. But they often regard it contemptuously as nonsensical and unpractical, as connected with dreams and fortune-telling, with hysteria and necromancy, with the search for the elixir of life and the philosopher's stone. Students, who should know better, perpetually speak as though the hidden side of things were intentionally concealed, as though knowledge with regard to it ought to be in the hands of all men, but was being deliberately withheld by the caprice or selfishness of a few. Whereas the fact is that nothing is or can be hidden from us except by our own limitations, and that for every man as he evolves the world grows wider and wider, because he is able to see more and more of its grandeur and its loveliness. As an objection against this statement may be cited the well-known fact that, at each of the great initiations which mark the advance of the neophyte along the path of the higher progress, a definite new block of knowledge is given to him. That is quite true, but the knowledge can be given only because the recipient has evolved to the point at which he can grasp it. It is no more being withheld from ordinary humanity than the knowledge of conic sections is being withheld from the child who is still struggling with the multiplication table. When that child reaches the level at which he can comprehend quadratic equations, the teacher is ready to explain to him the rules which govern them. In exactly the same way, when a man has qualified himself for the reception of the information given at a certain initiation, he is forthwith initiated. But the only way to attain the capacity to imbibe that higher knowledge is to begin by trying to understand our present conditions, and to order our lives intelligently in view of the facts which we find. Occultism, then, is the study of the hidden side of nature, or rather, it is the study of the whole of nature, instead of only that small part of it which comes under the investigation of modern science. At the present stage of our development, by far the greater part of nature is entirely unknown to the majority of mankind, because they have as yet unfolded only a minute proportion of the faculties which they possess. The ordinary man, therefore, is basing his philosophy, so far as he has any, upon entirely inadequate grounds. His actions are molded more or less in accordance with the few laws of nature which he knows, and consequently both his theory of life and his daily practice are necessarily inaccurate. The occultist adopts a far more comprehensive view. He takes into account those forces of the higher worlds whose action is hidden from the materialist, and so he molds his life in obedience to the entire code of nature's laws, instead of only by occasional reference to a minute fragment of it. It is difficult for the man who knows nothing of the occult to realize how great, how serious, and how all-pervading are his own limitations. The only way in which we can adequately symbolize them is to suppose some form of consciousness still more limited than our own, and to think in what directions it would differ from ours. Suppose it were possible that a consciousness could exist capable of appreciating only solid matter, the liquid and gaseous forms of matter being to it as entirely non-existent as are the etheric and astral and mental forms to the ordinary man. We can readily see how for such a consciousness any adequate conception of the world in which we live would be impossible. Solid matter, which alone could be perceived by it, would constantly be found to be undergoing serious modifications, about which no rational theory could be formed. For example, whenever a shower of rain took place, the solid matter of the earth would undergo change. It would in many cases become both softer and heavier when charged with moisture, but the reason of such a change would necessarily be wholly incomprehensible to the consciousness which we are supposing. The wind might lift clouds of sand and transfer them from one place to another, but such motion of solid matter would be entirely inexplicable to one who had no conception of the existence of the air. Without considering more examples of what is already so obvious, we see clearly how hopelessly inadequate would be such an idea of the world as would be attainable by this consciousness limited to solid matter. What we do not realize so readily, however, is that our present consciousness falls just as far short of that of the developed man as this supposed consciousness would fall short of that which we now possess. Theosophical students are at least theoretically acquainted with the idea that to everything there is a hidden side. And they also know that in the great majority of cases this unseen side is of far greater importance than that which is visible to the physical eye. To put the same idea from another point of view, the senses, by means of which we obtain all our information about external objects, are as yet imperfectly developed, therefore the information obtained is partial. What we see in the world about us is by no means all that there is to see, and a man who will take the trouble to cultivate his senses will find that, in proportion as he succeeds, life will become fuller and richer for him. For the lover of nature, of art, of music, a vast field of incredibly intensified and exalted pleasure lies close at hand, if he will fit himself to enter upon it. Above all, for the lover of his fellow man there is the possibility of far more intimate comprehension and therefore far wider usefulness. We are only halfway up the ladder of evolution at present, and so our senses are only half evolved. But it is possible for us to hurry up that ladder, possible, by hard work, to make our senses now what all men's senses will be in the distant future. The man who has succeeded in doing this is often called a seer or a clairvoyant. A fine word that, clairvoyant. It means one who sees clearly. But it has been horribly misused and degraded, so that people associate it with all sorts of trickery and imposture, with gypsies who for sixpence will tell a maid-servant what is the color of the hair of the duke who is coming to marry her. Or with establishments in Bond Street where for a guinea fee the veil of the future is supposed to be lifted for more aristocratic clients. All this is irregular and unscientific, in many cases it is mere charlatanry and barefaced robbery. But not always. To foresee the future up to a certain point is a possibility, it can be done, and it has been done, scores of times. And some of these irregular practitioners unquestionably do at times possess flashes of higher vision, though usually they cannot depend upon having them when they want them. But behind all this vagueness there is a bedrock of fact, something which can be approached rationally and studied scientifically. It is as the result of many years of such study and experiment that I state emphatically what I have written above, that it is possible for men to develop their senses until they can see much more of this wonderful and beautiful world in which we live than is ever suspected by the untrained average man, who lives contentedly in the midst of Cimmerian darkness and calls it light. 2,500 years ago the greatest of Indian teachers, Gautama the Buddha, said to his disciples, "Do not complain and cry and pray, but open your eyes and see. The truth is all about you, if you will only take the bandage from your eyes and look, and it is so wonderful, so beautiful, so far beyond anything that men have ever dreamt of or prayed for, and it is forever and forever." He assuredly meant far more than this of which I am writing now, but this is a step on the way towards that glorious goal of perfect realization. If it does not yet tell us quite all the truth, at any rate it gives us a good deal of it. It removes for us a host of common misconceptions, and clears up for us many points which are considered as mysteries or problems by those who are as yet uninstructed in this lore. It shows that all these things were mysteries and problems to us only because heretofore we saw so small a part of the facts, because we were looking at the various matters from below, and as isolated and unconnected fragments, instead of rising above them to a standpoint whence they are comprehensible as parts of a mighty whole. It settles in a moment many questions which have been much disputed, such, for example, as that of the continued existence of man after death. It explains many of the strange things which the churches tell us. It dispels our ignorance and removes our fear of the unknown by supplying us with a rational and orderly scheme. Besides all this, it opens up a new world to us in regard to our everyday life, a new world which is yet a part of the old. It shows us that, as I began by saying, there is a hidden side to everything, and that our most ordinary actions often produce results of which without this study we should never have known. By it we understand the rationale of what is commonly called telepathy, for we see that just as there are waves of heat or light or electricity, so there are waves produced by thought, though they are in a finer type of matter than the others, and therefore not perceptible to our physical senses. By studying these vibrations we see how thought acts. And we learn that it is a tremendous power for good or for ill, a power which we are all of us unconsciously wielding to some extent, which we can use 100-fold more effectively when we comprehend its workings. Further investigation reveals to us the method of formation of what are called thought forms, and indicates how these can be usefully employed both for ourselves and for others in a dozen different ways. The occultist studies carefully all these unseen effects, and consequently knows much more fully than other men the result of what he is doing. He has more information about life than others have, and he exercises his common sense by modifying his life in accordance with what he knows. In many ways we live differently now from our forefathers in medieval times, because we know more than they did. We have discovered certain laws of hygiene. Wise men live according to that knowledge, and therefore the average length of life is decidedly greater now than it was in the Middle Ages. There are still some who are foolish or ignorant, who either do not know the laws of health or are careless about keeping them. They think that because disease germs are invisible to them, they are therefore of no importance. They don't believe in new ideas. Those are the people who suffer first when an epidemic disease arrives, or some unusual strain is put upon the community. They suffer unnecessarily, because they are behind the times. But they injure not only themselves by their neglect. The conditions caused by their ignorance or carelessness often bring infection into a district which might otherwise be free from it. The matter of which I am writing is precisely the same thing at a different level. The microscope revealed disease germs. The intelligent man profited by the discovery, and rearranged his life, while the unintelligent man paid no attention, but went on as before. Clairvoyance reveals thought force and many other previously unsuspected powers. Once more the intelligent man profits by this discovery, and rearranges his life accordingly. Once more also the unintelligent man takes no heed of the new discoveries. Once more he thinks that what he cannot see can have no importance for him. Once more he continues to suffer quite unnecessarily, because he is behind the times. Not only does he often suffer positive pain, but he also misses so much of the pleasure of life. To painting, to music, to poetry, to literature, to religious ceremonies, to the beauties of nature there is always a hidden side, a fullness, a completeness beyond the mere physical. And the man who can see or sense this has at his command a wealth of enjoyment far beyond the comprehension of the man who passes through it all with unopened perceptions. The perceptions exist in every human being, though as yet undeveloped in most. To unfold them means generally a good deal of time and hard work, but it is exceedingly well worth while. Only let no man undertake the effort unless his motives are absolutely pure and unselfish, for he who seeks wider faculty for any but the most exalted purposes will bring upon himself a curse and not a blessing. But the man of affairs, who has no time to spare for a sustained effort to evolve nascent powers within himself, is not thereby debarred from sharing in some at least of the benefits derived from occult study. Any more than the man who possesses no microscope is thereby prevented from living hygienically. The latter has not seen the disease germs, but from the testimony of the specialist he knows that they exist, and he knows how to guard himself from them. Just in the same way a man who has as yet no dawning of clairvoyant vision may study the writings of those who have gained it, and in this way profit by the results of their labor. True, he cannot yet see all the glory and the beauty which are hidden from us by the imperfection of our senses, but he can readily learn how to avoid the unseen evil, and how to set in motion the unseen forces of good. So, long before he actually sees them, he can conclusively prove to himself their existence, just as the man who drives an electric motor proves to himself the existence of electricity, though he has never seen it and does not in the least know what it is. We must try to understand as much as we can of the world in which we live. We must not fall behind in the march of evolution, we must not let ourselves be anachronisms, for lack of interest in these new discoveries, which yet are only the presentation from a new point of view of the most archaic wisdom. Knowledge is power, in this case as in every other, in this case, as in every other, to secure the best results, the glorious trinity of power, wisdom and love must ever go hand in hand. There is a difference, however, between theoretical acquaintance and actual realization. And I have thought that it might help students somewhat towards the grasp of the realities to have a description of the unseen side of some of the simple transactions of everyday life as they appear to clairvoyant vision, to one, let us say, who has developed within himself the power of perception through the astral, mental and causal bodies. Their appearance as seen by means of the intuitional vehicle is infinitely grander and more effective still, but so entirely inexpressible that it seems useless to say anything about it. For on that level all experience is within the man instead of without, and the glory in the beauty of it is no longer something which he watches with interest, but something which he feels in his inmost heart, because it is part of himself. The object of this book is to give some hints as to the inner side of the world as a whole and of our daily life. We shall consider this latter in 3 divisions, which will resemble the conjugations of our youthful days in being passive, middle and active respectively, how we are influenced, how we influence ourselves, and how we influence others. And we shall conclude by observing a few of the results which must inevitably flow from a wider diffusion of this knowledge as to the realities of existence. Chapter 2. The World as a Whole. A wider outlook. When we look upon the world around us, we cannot hide from ourselves the existence of a vast amount of sorrow and suffering. True, much of it is obviously the fault of the sufferers, and might easily be avoided by the exercise of a little self-control and common sense, but there is also much which is not immediately self-induced, but undoubtedly comes from without. It often seems as though evil triumphs, as though justice fails in the midst of the storm and stress of the roaring confusion of life, and because of this many despair of the ultimate result. And doubt whether there is in truth any plan of definite progress behind all this bewildering chaos. It is all a question of the point of view. The man who is himself in the thick of the fight cannot judge of the plan of the general or the progress of the conflict. To understand the battle as a whole, one must withdraw from the tumult and look down upon the field from above. In exactly the same way, to comprehend the plan of the battle of life we must withdraw ourselves from it for the time. And in thought look down upon it from above, from the point of view not of the body which perishes but of the soul which lives forever. We must take into account not only the small part of life which our physical eyes can see, but the vast totality of which at present so much is invisible to us. Until that has been done we are in the position of a man looking from beneath at the under side of some huge piece of elaborate tapestry which is in process of being woven. The whole thing is to us but a confused medley of varied color, of ragged hanging ends, without order or beauty, and we are unable to conceive what all this mad clatter of machinery can be doing. But when through our knowledge of the hidden side of nature we are able to look down from above, the pattern begins to unfold itself before our eyes, and the apparent chaos shows itself as orderly progress. A more forcible analogy may be obtained by contemplating in imagination the view of life which would present itself to some tiny microbe whirled down by a resistless flood, such as that which rushes through the gorge of Niagara. Boiling, foaming, swirling, the force of that stream is so tremendous that its center is many feet higher than its sides. The microbe on the surface of such a torrent must be dashed hither and thither wildly amidst the foam, sometimes thrown high in air, sometimes whirled backwards in an eddy, unable to see the banks between which he is passing. Having every sense occupied in the mad struggle to keep himself somehow above water. To him that strife and stress is all the world of which he knows, how can he tell whither the stream is going? But the man who stands on the bank, looking down on it all, can see that all this bewildering tumult is merely superficial. And that the one fact of real importance is the steady onward sweep of those millions of tons of water downwards towards the sea. If we can furthermore suppose the microbe to have some idea of progress, and to identify it with forward motion, he might well be dismayed when he found himself hurled aside or borne backwards by an eddy. While the spectator could see that the apparent backward movement was but a delusion, since even the little eddies were all being swept onwards with the rest. It is no exaggeration to say that as is the knowledge of the microbe struggling in the stream to that of the man looking down upon it, so is the comprehension of life possessed by the man in the world to that of one who knows its hidden side. Best of all, though not so easy to follow because of the effort of imagination involved, is the parable offered to us by Mr. Hinton in his scientific romances. For purposes connected with his argument, Mr. Hinton supposes the construction of a large vertical wooden frame, from top to bottom of which are tightly stretched a multitude of threads at all sorts of angles. If then a sheet of paper be inserted horizontally in the frame so that these threads pass through it, it is obvious that each thread will make a minute hole in the paper. If then the frame as a whole be moved slowly upwards, but the paper kept still, various effects will be produced. When a thread is perpendicular it will slip through its hole without difficulty, but when a thread is fixed at an angle it will cut a slit in the paper as the frame moves. Suppose instead of a sheet of paper we have a thin sheet of wax, and let the wax be sufficiently viscous to close up behind the moving thread. Then instead of a number of slits we shall have a number of moving holes, and to a sight which cannot see the threads that cause them, the movement of these holes will necessarily appear irregular and inexplicable. Some will approach one another, some will recede, various patterns and combinations will be formed and dissolve, all depending upon the arrangement of the invisible threads. Now, by a still more daring flight of fancy, think not of the holes but of the minute sections of thread for the moment filling them, and imagine those sections as conscious atoms. They think of themselves as separate entities, they find themselves moving without their own volition in what seems a maze of inextricable confusion, and this bewildering dance is life as they know it. Yet all this apparent complexity and aimless motion is in fact a delusion caused by the limitation of the consciousness of those atoms, for only one extremely simple movement is really taking place, the steady upward motion of the frame as a whole. But the atom can never comprehend that until it realizes that it is not a separated fragment, but part of a thread. Which things are an allegory, and a very beautiful one. For the threads are ourselves, our true selves, our souls, and the atoms represent us in this earthly life. So long as we confine our consciousness to the atom, and look on life only from this earthly standpoint, we can never understand what is happening in the world. But if we will raise our consciousness to the point of view of the soul, the thread of which the bodily life is only a minute part and a temporary expression, we shall then see that there is a splendid simplicity at the back of all the complexity. A unity behind all the diversity. The complexity and the diversity are illusions produced by our limitations, the simplicity and the unity are real. The world in which we live has a hidden side to it, for the conception of it in the mind of the ordinary man in the street is utterly imperfect along three quite distinct lines. First, it has an extension at its own level which he is at present quite incapable of appreciating. Secondly, it has a higher side which is too refined for his undeveloped perceptions. Thirdly, it has a meaning and a purpose of which he usually has not the faintest glimpse. To say that we do not see the whole of our world is to state the case far too feebly. What we see is an absolutely insignificant part of it, beautiful though that part may be. And just as the additional extension is infinite compared to our idea of space, and cannot be expressed in its terms, so are the scope and the splendor of the whole infinitely greater than any conception that can possibly be formed of it here. And they cannot be expressed in any terms of that part of the world which we know. The fourth dimension. The extension spoken of under the first head has often been called the fourth dimension. Many writers have scoffed at this and denied its existence, yet for all that it remains a fact that our physical world is in truth a world of many dimensions, and that every object in it has an extension, however minute. In a direction which is unthinkable to us at our present stage of mental evolution. When we develop astral senses we are brought so much more directly into contact with this extension that our minds are more or less forced into recognition of it, and the more intelligent gradually grow to understand it. Though there are those of less intellectual growth who, even after death and in the astral world, cling desperately to their accustomed limitations and adopt most extraordinary and irrational hypotheses to avoid admitting the existence of the higher life which they so greatly fear. Because the easiest way for most people to arrive at a realization of the fourth dimension of space is to develop within themselves the power of astral sight. Many persons have come to suppose that the fourth dimension is an exclusive uppunnage of the astral world. A little thought will show that this cannot be so. Fundamentally there is only one kind of matter existing in the universe, although we call it physical, astral or mental according to the extent of its subdivision and the rapidity of its vibration. Consequently the dimensions of space, if they exist at all, exist independently of the matter which lies within them. And whether that space has 3 dimensions or 4 or more, all the matter within it exists subject to those conditions, whether we are able to appreciate them or not. It may perhaps help us a little in trying to understand this matter if we realize that what we call space is a limitation of consciousness, and that there is a higher level at which a sufficiently developed consciousness is entirely free from this. We may invest this higher consciousness with the power of expression in any number of directions, and may then assume that each descent into a denser world of matter imposes upon it an additional limitation, and shuts off the perception of one of these directions. We may suppose that by the time the consciousness has descended as far as the mental world only 5 of these directions remain to it. That when it descends or moves outward once more to the astral level it loses yet one more of its powers, and so is limited to the conception of 4 dimensions. Then the further descent or outward movement which brings it into the physical world cuts off from it the possibility of grasping even that 4th dimension, and so we find ourselves confined to the 3 with which we are familiar. Looking at it from this point of view, it is clear that the conditions of the universe have remained unaffected, though our power of appreciating them has changed. So that, although it is true that when our consciousness is functioning through astral matter we are able to appreciate a 4th dimension which normally is hidden from us while we work through the physical brain. We must not therefore make the mistake of thinking that the 4th dimension belongs to the astral world only and that physical matter exists somehow in a different kind of space from the astral or mental. Such a suggestion is shown to be unjustified by the fact that it is possible for a man using his physical brain to attain by means of practice the power of comprehending some of the 4-dimensional forms. I do not wish here to take up fully the consideration of this fascinating subject. Those who would follow it further should apply themselves to the works of Mr. C.H. Hinton, Scientific Romances and the Fourth Dimension, the former book for all the interesting possibilities connected with this study, and the latter for the means whereby the mind can realize the fourth dimension as a fact. For our present purposes it is necessary only to indicate that here is an aspect or extension of our world which, though utterly unknown to the vast majority of men, requires to be studied and to be taken into consideration by those who wish to understand the whole of life instead of only a tiny fragment of it. The higher world. There is a hidden side to our physical world in a second and higher sense which is well known to all students of theosophy. For many lectures have been delivered and many books have been written in the endeavor to describe the astral and mental worlds, the unseen realm which interpenetrates that with which we are all familiar, and forms by far the most important part of it. A good deal of information about this higher aspect of our world has been given in the 5th and the 6th of the Theosophical Manuals, and in my own book Upon the Other Side of Death. So here I need do no more than make a short general statement for the benefit of any reader who has not yet met with those works. Modern physicists tell us that matter is interpenetrated by ether, a hypothetical substance which they endow with many apparently contradictory qualities. The occultist knows that there are many varieties of this finer interpenetrative matter, and that some of the qualities attributed to it by the scientific men belong not to it at all, but to the primordial substance of which it is the negation. I do not wish here to turn aside from the object of this book to give a lengthy disquisition upon the qualities of ether. Those who wish to study this subject may be referred to the book Upon Occult Chemistry, page 93. Here it must suffice to say that the true ether of space exists, just as scientific men have supposed, and possesses most of the curious contradictory qualities ascribed to it. It is not, however, of that ether itself, but of matter built up out of the bubbles in it, that the inner worlds of finer matter are built, of which we have spoken just now. That with which we are concerned at the moment is the fact that all the matter visible to us is interpenetrated not only by ether, but also by various kinds of finer matter, and that of this finer matter there are many degrees. To the type which is nearest to the physical world occult students have given the name astral matter. The kind next above that has been called mental, because out of its texture is built that mechanism of consciousness which is commonly called the mind in man, and there are other types finer still, with which for the moment we are not concerned. Every portion of space with which we have to do must be thought of as containing all these different kinds of matter. It is practically a scientific postulate that even in the densest forms of matter no two particles ever touch one another, but each floats alone in its field of ether, like a sun in space. Just in the same way each particle of the physical ether floats in a sea of astral matter, and each astral particle in turn floats in a mental ocean. So that all these additional worlds need no more space than does this fragment which we know, for in truth they are all parts of one and the same world. Man has within himself matter of these finer grades, and by learning to focus his consciousness in it, instead of only in his physical brain, he may become cognizant of these inner and higher parts of the world, and acquire much knowledge of the deepest interest and value. The nature of this unseen world, its scenery, its inhabitants, its possibilities, are described in the works above mentioned. It is the existence of these higher realms of nature that makes occultism possible. And few indeed are the departments of life in which their influence has not to be considered. From the cradle to the grave we are in close relation with them during what we call our waking life. During sleep and after we are even more intimately connected with them, for our existence is then almost confined to them. Perhaps the greatest of the many fundamental changes which are inevitable for the man who studies the facts of life is that which is produced in his attitude towards death. This matter has been fully treated elsewhere. Here I need state only that the knowledge of the truth about death robs it of all its terror and much of its sorrow, and enables us to see it in its true proportion and to understand its place in the scheme of our evolution. It is perfectly possible to learn to know about all these things instead of accepting beliefs blindly at second hand, as most people do, and knowledge means power, security, and happiness. The purpose of life. The third aspect of our world which is hidden from the majority is the plan and purpose of existence. Most men seem to muddle through life without any discernible object, except possibly the purely physical struggle to make money or attain power, because they vaguely think that these things will bring them happiness. They have no definite theory as to why they are here, nor any certainty as to the future that awaits them. They have not even realized that they are souls and not bodies, and that as such their development is part of a mighty scheme of cosmic evolution. When once this grandest of truths has dawned upon a man's horizon there comes over him that change which Occidental religion calls conversion, a fine word which has been sadly degraded by improper associations. For it has often been used to signify nothing more than a crisis of emotion hypnotically induced by the surging waves of excited feeling radiated by a half-maddened crowd. Its true meaning is exactly what its derivation implies, a turning together with. Before it, the man, unaware of the stupendous current of evolution, has, under the delusion of selfishness, been fighting against it. But the moment that the magnificence of the divine plan bursts upon his astonished sight there is no other possibility for him but to throw all his energies into the effort to promote its fulfillment. To turn and go together with that splendid stream of the love and the wisdom of God. His one object then is to qualify himself to help the world, and all his thoughts and actions are directed towards that aim. He may forget for the moment under the stress of temptation, but the oblivion can be only temporary. And this is the meaning of the ecclesiastical dogma that the elect can never finally fail. Discrimination has come to him, the opening of the doors of the mind, to adopt the terms employed for this change in older faiths. He knows now what is real and what is unreal, what is worth gaining and what is valueless. He lives as an immortal soul who is a spark of the divine fire, instead of as one of the beasts that perish, to use a biblical phrase which, however, is entirely incorrect, inasmuch as the beasts do not perish, except in the sense of their being reabsorbed into their group soul. Most truly for this man an aspect of life has been displayed which erst was hidden from his eyes. It would even be truer to say that now for the first time he has really begun to live, while before he merely dragged out an inefficient existence. Second section. How we are influenced. Chapter 3. By planets. Radiations. The first fact which it is necessary for us to realize is that everything is radiating influence on its surroundings. And these surroundings are all the while returning the compliment by pouring influence upon it in return. Literally everything, sun, moon, stars, angels, men, animals, trees, rocks, everything is pouring out a ceaseless stream of vibrations, each of its own characteristic type, not in the physical world only, but in other and subtler worlds as well. Our physical senses can appreciate only a limited number of such radiations. We readily feel the heat poured forth by the sun or by a fire, but we are usually not conscious of the fact that we ourselves are constantly radiating heat. Yet if we hold out a hand towards a radiometer, the delicate instrument will respond to the heat imparted by that hand even at a distance of several feet, and will begin to revolve. We say that a rose has a scent and that a daisy has none. Yet the daisy is throwing off particles just as much as the rose, only in the one case they happen to be perceptible to our senses, and in the other they are not. From early ages men have believed that the sun, the moon, the planets, and the stars exercised a certain influence over human life. In the present day most people are content to laugh at such a belief, without knowing anything about it. Yet anyone who will take the trouble to make a careful and impartial study of astrology will discover much that cannot be lightly thrown aside. He will meet with plenty of errors, no doubt, some of them ridiculous enough. But he will also find a proportion of accurate results which is far too large to be reasonably ascribed to coincidence. His investigations will convince him that there is unquestionably some foundation for the claims of the astrologers, while at the same time he cannot but observe that their systems are as yet far from perfect. When we remember the enormous space that separates us from even the nearest of the planets, it is at once obvious that we must reject the idea that they can exercise upon us any physical action worth considering. And furthermore, if there were any such action, it would seem that its strength should depend less upon the position of the planet in the sky than upon its proximity to the Earth, a factor which is not usually taken into account by astrologers. The more we contemplate the matter, the less does it seem rational or possible to suppose that the planets can affect the Earth or its inhabitants to any appreciable extent. Yet the fact remains that a theory based upon this apparent impossibility often works out accurately. Perhaps the explanation may be found along the line that just as the movement of the hands of a clock shows the passage of time, though it does not cause it, so the motions of the planets indicate the prevalence of certain influences, but are in no way responsible for them. Let us see what light occult study throws upon this somewhat perplexing subject. The deity of the solar system. Occult students regard the entire solar system in all its vast complexity as a partial manifestation of one great living being, and all its parts as expressing aspects of him. Many names have been given to him. In our theosophical literature he has often been described under the Gnostic title of the Logos, the word that was in the beginning with God, and was God, but now we usually speak of him as the solar deity. All the physical constituents of the solar system, the sun with its wonderful corona, all the planets with their satellites, their oceans, their atmospheres, and the various ethers surrounding them, all these are collectively his physical body. The expression of him in the physical realm. In the same way the collective astral worlds, not only the astral worlds belonging to each of the physical planets, but also the purely astral planets of all the chains of the system, such, for example, as planets B and F of our chain, make up his astral body, and the collective worlds of the mental realm are his mental body, the vehicle through which he manifests himself upon that particular level. Every atom of every world is a center through which he is conscious, so that not only is it true that God is omnipresent, but also that whatever is God. Thus we see that the old pantheistic conception was quite true, yet it is only a part of the truth, because while all nature in all its worlds is nothing but his garment, yet he himself exists outside of and above all this in a stupendous life of which we can know nothing, a life among other rulers of other systems. Just as all our lives are lived literally within him and are in truth a part of his, so his life and that of the solar deities of countless other systems are a part of a still greater life of the deity of the visible universe. And if there be in the depths of space yet other universes invisible to us, all of their deities in turn must in the same way form part of one great consciousness which includes the whole. Different types of matter. In these bodies of the solar deity on their various levels there are certain different classes or types of matter, which are fairly equally distributed over the whole system. I am not speaking here of our usual division of the worlds and their subsections, a division which is made according to the density of the matter, so that in the physical world, for example, we have the solid, liquid, gaseous, etheric, superetheric, subatomic and atomic conditions of matter, all of them physical, but differing in density. The types which I mean constitute a totally distinct series of cross-divisions, each of which contains matter in all its different conditions, so that if we denote the various types by numbers, we shall find solid, liquid and gaseous matter of the first type, solid, liquid and gaseous matter of the second type, and so on all the way through. These types of matter are as thoroughly intermingled as are the constituents of our atmosphere. Conceive a room filled with air. Any decided vibration communicated to the air, such as a sound, for example, would be perceptible in every part of the room. Suppose that it were possible to produce some kind of undulation which should affect the oxygen alone without disturbing the nitrogen, that undulation would still be felt in every part of the room. If we allow that, for a moment, the proportion of oxygen might be greater in one part of the room than another, then the oscillation, though perceptible everywhere, would be strongest in that part. Just as the air in a room is composed, principally, of oxygen and nitrogen, so is the matter of the solar system composed of these different types. And just as a wave, if there could be such a thing, which affected only the oxygen or only the nitrogen would nevertheless be felt in all parts of the room, so a movement or modification which affects only one of these types produces an effect throughout the entire solar system, though it may be stronger in one part than in another. This statement is true of all worlds, but for the sake of clearness let us for the moment confine our thought to one world only. Perhaps the idea is easiest to follow with regard to the astral. It has often been explained that in the astral body of man, matter belonging to each of the astral subsections is to be found, and that the proportion between the denser and the finer kinds shows how far that body is capable of responding to coarse or refined desires, and so is to some extent an indication of the degree to which the man has evolved himself. Similarly, in each astral body there is matter of each of these types, and in this case the proportion between them will show the disposition of the man, whether he is devotional or philosophic, artistic or scientific, pragmatic or mystic. The living centers. Now each of these types of matter in the astral body of the solar deity is to some extent a separate vehicle, and may be thought of as also the astral body of a subsidiary deity or minister, who is at the same time an aspect of the deity of the system, a kind of ganglion or force center in him. Indeed, if these types differ among themselves, it is because the matter composing them originally came forth through these different living centers, and the matter of each type is still the special vehicle and expression of the subsidiary deity through whom it came, so that the slightest thought, movement or alteration of any kind in him is instantly reflected in some way or other in all the matter of the corresponding type. Naturally, each such type of matter has its own special affinities, and is capable of vibrating under influences which may probably evoke no response from the other types. Since every man has within himself matter of all these types, it is obvious that any modification in or action of any one of these great living centers must to some degree affect all beings in the system. The extent to which any particular person is so affected depends upon the proportion of the type of matter acted upon which he happens to have in his astral body. Consequently, we find different types of men as of matter, and by reason of their constitution, by the very composition of their astral bodies, some of them are more susceptible to one influence, some to another. The types are 7, and astrologers have often given to them the names of certain of the planets. Each type is divided into 7 subtypes, because each planet may be either practically uninfluenced, or it may be affected predominantly by any one of the other 6. In addition to the 49 definite subtypes thus obtained, there are any number of possible permutations and combinations of influences, often so complicated that it is no easy matter to follow them. Nevertheless, this gives us a certain system of classification, according to which we can arrange not only human beings, but also the animal, vegetable and mineral kingdoms, and the elemental essence which precedes them in evolution. Everything in the solar system belongs to one or other of these 7 great streams, because it has come out through one or other of these great force centers, to which therefore it belongs in essence. Although it must inevitably be affected more or less by the others also. This gives each man, each animal, each plant, each mineral a certain fundamental characteristic which never changes, sometimes symbolized as his note, his color, or his ray. This characteristic is permanent not only through one chain period, but through the whole planetary scheme, so that the life which manifests through elemental essence of type A will in the due course of its evolution ensoul successively minerals, plants, and animals of type A. And when its group soul breaks up into units and receives the third outpouring, the human beings which are the result of its evolution will be men of type A and no other. And under normal conditions will continue so all through their development until they grow into adepts of type A. In the earlier days of theosophical study we were under the impression that this plan was carried out consistently to the very end. And that these adepts rejoined the solar deity through the same subsidiary deity or minister through whom they originally came forth. Further research shows that this thought requires modification. We find that bands of egos of many different types join themselves together for a common object. For example, in the investigations connected primarily with the lives of Alcyone it was found that certain bands of egos circled round the various masters, and came closer and closer to them as time went on. One by one, as they became fit for it, these egos reached the stage at which they were accepted as pupils or apprentices by one or other of the masters. To become truly a pupil of a master means entering into relations with him whose intimacy is far beyond any tie of which we know on earth. It means a degree of union with him which no words can fully express, although at the same time a pupil retains absolutely his own individuality and his own initiative. In this way each master becomes a center of what may be truly described as a great organism, since his pupils are veritably members of him. When we realize that he himself is in just the same way a member of some still greater master we arrive at a conception of a mighty organism which is in a very real sense one, although built up of thousands of perfectly distinct egos. Such an organism is the heavenly man who emerges as the result of the evolution of each great root race. In him, as in an earthly man, are 7 great centers, each of which is a mighty adept. And the Manu and the Bodhisattva occupy in this great organism the place of the brain and the heart centers respectively. Round them and yet not round them, but in them and part of them, although so fully and gloriously ourselves shall we, their servants, be. And this great figure in its totality represents the flower of that particular race, and includes all who have attained adeptship through it. Each root race is thus represented at its close by one of these heavenly men. And they, these splendid totalities, will, as their next stage in evolution, become ministers themselves of some future solar deity. Yet each one of these contains within himself men of all possible types, so that each of these future ministers is in truth a representative not of one line but of all lines. When looked at from a sufficiently high level the whole solar system is seen to consist of these great living centers or ministers, and the types of matter through which each is expressing himself. Let me repeat here for the sake of clearness, what I wrote some time ago on this subject in the Inner Life, volume I, page 217. Each of these great living centers has a sort of orderly periodic change or motion of his own, corresponding perhaps on some infinitely higher level to the regular beating of the human heart, or to the inspiration and expiration of the breath. Some of these periodic changes are more rapid than others, so that a complicated series of effects is produced. And it has been observed that the movements of the physical planets in their relation to one another furnish a clue to the operation of these influences at any given moment. Each of these centers has his special location or major focus within the body of the Sun, and a minor exterior focus which is always marked by the position of a planet. The exact relation can hardly be made clear in our three-dimensional phraseology, but we may perhaps put it that each center has a field of influence practically coextensive with a solar system. That if a section of this field could be taken it would be found to be elliptical, and that one of the foci of each ellipse would always be the Sun, and the other would be the special planet ruled by that minister. It is probable that, in the gradual condensation of the original glowing nebula from which the system was formed, the location of the planets was determined by the formation of vortices at these minor foci. They being auxiliary points of distribution of these influences, ganglia, as it were, in the solar system. It must of course be understood that we are referring here not to the curious astrological theory which considers the Sun himself as a planet, but to the real planets which revolve round him. Their influence. The influences belonging to these great types differ widely in quality, and one way in which this difference shows itself is in their action upon the living elemental essence both in man and around him. Be it ever remembered that this dominance is exerted in all worlds, not only in the astral, though we are just now confining ourselves to that for simplicity's sake. These mysterious agencies may have, and indeed must have, other and more important lines of action not at present known to us. But this at least forces itself upon the notice of the observer, that each center produces its own special effect upon the manifold varieties of elemental essence. One, for example, will be found greatly to stimulate the activity and the vitality of those kinds of essence which specially appertain to the center through which it comes, while apparently checking and controlling others. The sway of another type will be seen to be strong over a quite different set of essences which belong to its center, while apparently not affecting the previous set in the least. There are all sorts of combinations and permutations of these mystic powers, the action of one of them being in some cases greatly intensified and in others almost neutralized by the presence of another. Since this elemental essence is vividly active in the astral and mental bodies of man, it is clear that any unusual excitation of any of these classes of that essence, any sudden increase in its activity, must undoubtedly affect to some extent either his emotions or his mind, or both. And it is also obvious that these forces would work differently on different men, because of the varieties of essence entering into their composition. These influences neither exist nor are exercised for the sake of the man or with any reference to him, any more than the wind exists for the sake of the vessel which is helped or hindered by it. They are part of the play of cosmic forces of whose object we know nothing, though we may to some extent learn how to calculate upon them and to use them. Such energies in themselves are no more good nor evil than any other of the powers of nature, like electricity or any other great natural force. They may be helpful or hurtful to us, according to the use that we make of them. Just as certain experiments are more likely to be successful if undertaken when the air is heavily charged with electricity, while certain others under such conditions will most probably fail. So an effort involving the use of the powers of our mental and emotional nature will more or less readily achieve its object according to the influences which predominate when it is made. Liberty of action. It is of the utmost importance for us to understand that such pressure cannot dominate man's will in the slightest degree. All it can do is in some cases to make it easier or more difficult for that will to act along certain lines. In no case can a man be swept away by it into any course of action without his own consent, though he may evidently be helped or hindered by it in any effort that he chances to be making. The really strong man has little need to trouble himself as to the agencies which happen to be in the ascendant, but for men of weaker will it may sometimes be worth while to know at what moment this or that force can most advantageously be applied. These factors may be put aside as a negligible quantity by the man of iron determination or by the student of true occultism. But since most men still allow themselves to be the helpless sport of the forces of desire, and have not yet developed anything worth calling a will of their own, their feebleness permits these influences to assume an importance in human life to which they have intrinsically no claim. For example, a certain variety of pressure may occasionally bring about a condition of affairs in which all forms of nervous excitement are considerably intensified, and there is consequently a general sense of irritability abroad. That condition cannot cause a quarrel between sensible people. But under such circumstances disputes arise far more readily than usual, even on the most trifling pretexts. And the large number of people who seem to be always on the verge of losing their tempers are likely to relinquish all control of themselves on even less than ordinary provocation. It may sometimes happen that such influences, playing on the smoldering discontent of ignorant jealousy, may fan it into an outburst of popular frenzy from which widespread disaster may ensue. Even in such a case as this we must guard ourselves against the fatal mistake of supposing the influence to be evil because man's passions turn it to evil effect. The force itself is simply a wave of activity sent forth from one of the centers of the deity, and is in itself of the nature of an intensification of certain vibrations, necessary perhaps to produce some far-reaching cosmic effect. The increased activity produced incidentally by its means in the astral body of a man offers him an opportunity of testing his power to manage his vehicles. And whether he succeeds or fails in this, it is still one of the lessons which help in his evolution. Karma may throw a man into certain surroundings or bring him under certain influences, but it can never force him to commit a crime, though it may so place him that it requires great determination on his part to avoid that crime. It is possible, therefore, for an astrologer to warn a man of the circumstances under which at a given time he will find himself. But any definite prophecy as to his action under those circumstances can only be based upon probabilities, though we may readily recognize how nearly such prophecies become certainties in the case of the ordinary will-less man. From the extraordinary mixture of success and failure which characterize modern astrological predictions, it seems fairly certain that the practitioners of this art are not fully acquainted with all the necessary factors. In a case into which only those factors enter which are already fairly well understood, success is achieved, but in cases where unrecognized factors come into play we have naturally more or less complete failure as the result. Chapter 4. By the Sun. The heat of the sun. Those who are interested in astronomy will find the occult side of that science one of the most fascinating studies within our reach. Obviously it would be at once too recondite and too technical for inclusion in such a book as this, which is concerned more immediately with such of the unseen phenomena as affect us practically in our daily life. But the connection of the sun with that life is so intimate that it is necessary that a few words should be said about him. The whole solar system is truly the garment of its deity, but the sun is his veritable epiphany, the nearest that we can come in the physical realm to a manifestation of him, the lens through which his power shines forth upon us. Regarded purely from the physical point of view, the sun is a vast mass of glowing matter at almost inconceivably high temperatures, and in a condition of electrification so intense as to be altogether beyond our experience. Astronomers, supposing his heat to be due merely to contraction, used to calculate how long he must have existed in the past, and how long it would be possible for him to maintain it in the future. And they found themselves unable to allow more than a few 100,000 years either way, while the geologists on the other hand claim that on this earth alone we have evidence of processes extending over millions of years. The discovery of radium has upset the older theories, but even with its aid they have not yet risen to the simplicity of the real explanation of the difficulty. One can imagine some intelligent microbe living in or upon a human body and arguing about its temperature in precisely the same way. He might say that it must of course be a gradually cooling body, and he might calculate with exactitude that in so many hours or minutes it must reach a temperature that would render continued existence impossible for him. If he lived long enough, however, he would find that the human body did not cool, as according to his theories it should do, and no doubt this would seem to him very mysterious. Unless and until he discovered that he was dealing not with a dying fire but with a living being, and that as long as the life remained the temperature would not sink. In exactly the same way if we realize that the sun is the physical manifestation of the solar deity, we shall see that the mighty life behind it will assuredly keep up its temperature as long as may be necessary for the full evolution of the system. The willow leaves. A similar explanation offers us a solution of some of the other problems of solar physics. For example, the phenomena called from their shape the willow leaves or rice grains, of which the photosphere of the sun is practically composed. have often puzzled exoteric students by the apparently irreconcilable characteristics which they present. From their position they can be nothing else than masses of glowing gas at an exceedingly high temperature, and therefore of great tenuity. Yet though they must be far lighter than any terrestrial cloud, they never fail to maintain their peculiar shape. However wildly they may be tossed about in the very midst of storms of power so tremendous that they would instantly destroy the earth itself. When we realize that behind each of these strange objects there is a splendid life, that each may be considered as the physical body of a great angel, we comprehend that it is that life which holds them together and gives them their wonderful stability. To apply to them the term physical body may perhaps mislead us, because for us the life in the physical seems of so much importance and occupies so prominent a position in the present stage of our evolution. Madame Blavatsky has told us that we cannot truly describe them as solar inhabitants, since the solar beings will hardly place themselves in telescopic focus, but that they are the reservoirs of solar vital energy, themselves partaking of the life which they pour forth. Let us say rather that the willow leaves are manifestations upon the physical level maintained by the solar angels for a special purpose, at the cost of a certain sacrifice or limitation of their activities on the higher levels which are their normal habitat. Remembering that it is through these willow leaves that the light, heat and vitality of the sun come to us, we may readily see that the object of this sacrifice is to bring down to the physical level certain forces which would otherwise remain unmanifested, and that these great angels are acting as channels, as reflectors, as specializers of divine power, that they are in fact doing at cosmic levels and for a solar system what, if we are wise enough to use our privileges, we ourselves may do on a microscopical scale in our own little circle. As will be seen in a later chapter. Vitality. We all know the feeling of cheerfulness and well-being which sunlight brings to us, but only students of occultism are fully aware of the reasons for that sensation. Just as the sun floods his system with light and heat, so does he perpetually pour out into it another force as yet unsuspected by modern science, a force to which has been given the name vitality. This is radiated on all levels, and manifests itself in each realm, physical, emotional, mental and the rest, but we are specially concerned for the moment with its appearance in the lowest, where it enters some of the physical atoms, immensely increases their activity, and makes them animated and glowing. We must not confuse this force with electricity, though it in some ways resembles it. The deity sends forth from himself three great forms of energy, there may be hundreds more of which we know nothing, but at least there are three. Each of them has its appropriate manifestation at every level which our students have yet reached, but for the moment let us think of them as they show themselves in the physical world. One of them exhibits itself as electricity, another as vitality, and the third as the serpent fire, of which I have already written in the Inner Life. These three remain distinct, and none of them can at this level be converted into either of the others. They have no connection with any of the three great outpourings. All of those are definite efforts made by the solar deity, while these seem rather to be results of his life, his qualities in manifestation without any visible effort. Electricity, while it is rushing through the atoms, deflects them and holds them in a certain way, this effect being in addition to and quite apart from the special rate of vibration which it also imparts to them. But the action of vitality differs in many ways from that of electricity, light or heat. Any of the variants of this latter force cause oscillation of the atom as a whole, an oscillation the size of which is enormous as compared with that of the atom. But this other force which we call vitality comes to the atom not from without, but from within. The vitality globule. The atom is itself nothing but the manifestation of a force. The solar deity wills a certain shape which we call an ultimate physical atom, and by that effort of his will some 14,000 million bubbles are held in that particular form. It is necessary to emphasize the fact that the cohesion of the bubbles in that form is entirely dependent upon that effort of will, so that if that were for a single instant withdrawn, the bubbles must fall apart again, and the whole physical realm would simply cease to exist in far less than the period of a flash of lightning. So true is it that the whole world is nothing but illusion, even from this point of view, to say nothing of the fact that the bubbles of which the atom is built are themselves only holes in Koilan, the true ether of space. So it is the will force of the solar deity continually exercised which holds the atom together as such. And when we try to examine the action of that force we see that it does not come into the atom from outside, but wells up within it, which means that it enters it from higher dimensions. The same is true with regard to this other force which we call vitality. It enters the atom from within, along with the force that holds that atom together, instead of acting upon it entirely from without, as do those other varieties of force which we call light, heat or electricity. When vitality wells up thus within the atom it endows it with an additional life, and gives it a power of attraction, so that it immediately draws round it 6 other atoms, which it arranges in a definite form. This making what has been called in occult chemistry a hypermetaproto-element. But this element differs from all others which have so far been observed, in that the force which creates it and holds it together comes from the second aspect of the solar deity instead of from the third. This vitality globule is drawn upon page 45 of Occult Chemistry, where it stands first at the left hand of the top line in the diagram. It is the little group which makes the exceedingly brilliant bead upon the male or positive snake in the chemical element oxygen, and it is also the heart of the central globe in radium. These globules are conspicuous above all others which may be seen floating in the atmosphere, on account of their brilliance and extreme activity, the intensely vivid life which they show. These are probably the fiery lives so often mentioned by Madame Blavatsky, though she appears to employ that term in 2 senses. In The Secret Doctrine, Volume 2, 709, it seems to mean the globule as a whole, in Volume I, 283, it probably means the original additionally vitalist atoms, each of which draws round itself 6 others. While the force that vivifies the globules is quite different from light, it nevertheless appears to depend upon light for its power of manifestation. In brilliant sunshine this vitality is constantly welling up afresh, and the globules are generated with great rapidity and in incredible numbers. But in cloudy weather there is a great diminution in the number of globules formed, and during the night the operation appears to be entirely suspended. During the night, therefore, we may be said to be living upon the stock manufactured during the previous day, and though it appears practically impossible that it should ever be entirely exhausted, that stock evidently does run low when there is a long succession of cloudy days. The globule, once charged, remains as a subatomic element, and does not appear to be subject to any change or loss of force unless and until it is absorbed by some living creature. The absorption of vitality. This vitality is absorbed by all living organisms, and a sufficient supply of it seems to be a necessity of their existence. In the case of men and the higher animals it is absorbed through the center or vortex in the etheric double which corresponds with the spleen. It will be remembered that that center has 6 petals, made by the undulatory movement of the forces which cause the vortex. But this undulatory movement is itself caused by the radiation of other forces from the center of that vortex. Imaging the central point of the vortex as the hub of a wheel, we may think of these last-mentioned forces as represented by spokes radiating from it in straight lines. Then the vortical forces, sweeping round and round, pass alternately under and over these spokes as though they were weaving a kind of etheric basketwork, and in this way is obtained the appearance of 6 petals separated by depressions. When the unit of vitality is flashing about in the atmosphere, brilliant as it is almost colorless, and may be compared to white light. But as soon as it is drawn into the vortex of the force center at the spleen it is decomposed and breaks up into streams of different colors, though it does not follow exactly our division of the spectrum. As its component atoms are whirled round the vortex, each of the 6 spokes seizes upon one of them, so that all the atoms charged with yellow rush along one, and all those charged with green along another, and so on. While the 7th disappears through the center of the vortex, through the hub of the wheel, as it were. Those rays then rush off in different directions, each to do its special work in the vitalization of the body. As I have said, however, the divisions are not exactly those which we ordinarily use in the solar spectrum, but rather resemble the arrangement of colors which we see on higher levels in the causal, mental and astral bodies. For example, what we call indigo is divided between the violet ray and the blue ray, so that we find only 2 divisions there instead of 3, but on the other hand what we call red is divided into two, rose red and dark red. The 6 radiants are therefore violet, blue, green, yellow, orange, and dark red. While the 7th or rose red atom, more properly the first, since this is the original atom in which the force first appeared, passes down through the center of the vortex. Vitality is thus clearly 7-fold in its constitution, but it rushes through the body in 5 main streams, as has been described in some of the Indian books. Superscript 1, to them spoke the principal life, be not lost in delusion I even. 5-fold dividing myself, uphold this body by my support. Prajnapanishad 2, 3. From this proceed these 7 flames. Ibid, 3, 5, for after issuing from splenic center the blue and the violet join into one ray, and so do the orange and the dark red. 1. The violet-blue ray flashes upwards to the throat, where it seems to divide itself, the light blue remaining to course through and vivify the throat center, while the dark blue and violet pass on into the brain. The dark blue expends itself in the lower and central parts of the brain, while the violet floods the upper part and appears to give special vigor to the force center at the top of the head, diffusing itself chiefly through the 960 petals of the outer part of that center. 2. The yellow ray is directed to the heart, but after doing its work there, part of it also passes on to the brain and permeates it, directing itself principally to the 12-petaled flower in the midst of the highest force center. 3. The green ray floods the abdomen and, while centering especially in the solar plexus, evidently vivifies the liver, kidneys and intestines, and the digestive apparatus generally. 4. The rose-colored ray runs all over the body along the nerves, and is clearly the life of the nervous system. This is what is commonly described as vitality, the specialized vitality which one man may readily pour into another in whom it is deficient. If the nerves are not fully supplied with this rosy light they become sensitive and intensely irritable, so that the patient finds it almost impossible to remain in one position, and yet gains but little ease when he moves to another. The least noise or touch is agony to him, and he is in a condition of acute misery. The flooding of his nerves with specialized vitality by some healthy person brings instant relief, and a feeling of healing and peace descends upon him. A man in robust health usually absorbs and specializes so much more vitality than is actually needed by his own body that he is constantly radiating a torrent of rose-colored atoms, and so unconsciously pours strength upon his weaker fellows without losing anything himself. Or by an effort of his will he can gather together this superfluous energy and aim it intentionally at one whom he wishes to help. The physical body has a certain blind, instinctive consciousness of its own, corresponding in the physical world to the desire elemental of the astral body. And this consciousness seeks always to protect it from danger, or to procure for it whatever may be necessary. This is entirely apart from the consciousness of the man himself, and it works equally well during the absence of the ego from the physical body during sleep. All our instinctive movements are due to it, and it is through its activity that the working of the sympathetic system is carried on ceaselessly without any thought or knowledge on our part. While we are what we call awake, this physical elemental is perpetually occupied in self-defense, he is in a condition of constant vigilance, and he keeps the nerves and muscles always tense. During the night or at any time when we sleep he lets the nerves and muscles relax, and devotes himself specially to the assimilation of vitality, and the recuperation of the physical body. He works at this most successfully during the early part of the night, because then there is plenty of vitality, whereas immediately before the dawn the vitality which has been left behind by the sunlight is almost completely exhausted. This is the reason for the feeling of limpness and deadness associated with the small hours of the morning. This is also the reason why sick men so frequently die at that particular time. The same idea is embodied in the old proverb that, an hour's sleep before midnight is worth 2 after it. The work of this physical elemental accounts for the strong recuperative influence of sleep, which is often observable even when it is a mere momentary nap. This vitality is indeed the food of the etheric double, and is just as necessary to it as is sustenance to the grosser part of the physical body. Hence when the body is unable for any reason, as through sickness, fatigue or extreme old age, to prepare vitality for the nourishment of its cells, This physical elemental endeavors to draw in for his own use vitality which has already been prepared in the bodies of others. And thus it happens that we often find ourselves weak and exhausted after sitting for a while with a person who is depleted of vitality. Because he has drawn away from us by suction the rose-colored atoms before we were able to extract their energy. The vegetable kingdom also absorbs this vitality, but seems in most cases to use only a small part of it. Many trees draw from it almost exactly the same constituents as does the higher part of man's etheric body, the result being that when they have used what they require, the atoms which they reject are precisely those charged with the rose-colored light which is needed for the cells of man's physical body. This is specially the case with such trees as the pine and the eucalyptus. And consequently the very neighborhood of these trees gives health and strength to those who are suffering from lack of this part of the vital principle, those whom we call nervous people. They are nervous because the cells of their bodies are hungry, and the nervousness can only be allayed by feeding them, and often the readiest way to do that is thus to supply them from without with the special kind of vitality which they need. 5. The orange-red ray flows to the base of the spine and thence to the generative organs, with which one part of its functions is closely connected. This ray appears to include not only the orange and the darker reds, but also a certain amount of dark purple, as though the spectrum bent round in a circle and the colors began over again at a lower octave. In the normal man this ray energizes the desires of the flesh, and also seems to enter the blood and keep up the heat of the body. But if a man persistently refuses to yield to his lower nature, this ray can by long and determined effort be deflected upwards to the brain, where all three of its constituents undergo a remarkable modification. The orange is raised into pure yellow, and produces a decided intensification of the powers of the intellect. The dark red becomes crimson, and greatly increases the power of unselfish affection. While the dark purple is transmuted into a lovely pale violet, and quickens the spiritual part of man's nature. The man who achieves this transmutation will find that sensual desires no longer trouble him, and when it becomes necessary for him to arouse the serpent fire, he will be free from the most serious of the dangers of that process. When a man has finally completed this change, this orange-red ray passes straight into the center at the base of the spine, and from that runs upwards along the hollow of the vertebral column, and so to the brain. Vitality and health. The flow of vitality in these various currents regulates the health of the parts of the body with which they are concerned. If, for example, a person is suffering from a weak digestion, it manifests itself at once to any person possessing etheric sight. Because either the flow and action of the green stream is sluggish or its amount is smaller in proportion than it should be. Where the yellow current is full and strong, it indicates, or more properly produces, strength and regularity in the action of the heart. Flowing round that center, it also interpenetrates the blood which is driven through it, and is sent along with it all over the body. Yet there is enough of it left to extend into the brain also, and the power of high philosophical and metaphysical thought appears to depend to a great extent upon the volume and activity of this yellow stream. And the corresponding awakening of the 12-petaled flower in the middle of the force center at the top of the head. Thought and emotion of a high spiritual type seem to depend largely upon the violet ray, whereas the power of ordinary thought is stimulated by the action of the blue mingled with part of the yellow. It has been observed that in some forms of idiocy the flow of vitality to the brain, both yellow and blue-violet, is almost entirely inhibited. Unusual activity or volume in the light blue which is apportioned to the throat center is accompanied by the health and strength of the physical organs in that part of the body. It gives, for example, strength and elasticity to the vocal cords, so that special brilliance and activity are noticeable in the case of a public speaker or a great singer. Weakness or disease in any part of the body is accompanied by a deficiency in the flow of vitality to that part. As the different streams of atoms do their work, the charge of vitality is withdrawn from them, precisely as an electrical charge might be. The atoms bearing the rose-colored ray grow gradually paler as they are swept along the nerves, and are eventually thrown out from the body through the pores, making thus what was called in man visible and invisible the health aura. By the time that they leave the body most of them have lost the rose-colored light, so that the general appearance of the emanation is bluish-white. That part of the yellow ray which is absorbed into the blood and carried round with it loses its distinctive color in just the same way. The atoms, when thus emptied of their charge of vitality, either enter into some of the combinations which are constantly being made in the body, or pass out of it through the pores, or through the ordinary channels. The emptied atoms of the green ray, which is connected chiefly with digestive processes, seem to form part of the ordinary waste material of the body, and to pass out along with it. And that is also the fate of the atoms of the red-orange ray in the case of the ordinary man. The atoms belonging to the blue rays, which are used in connection with the throat center, generally leave the body in the exhalations of the breath. And those which compose the dark blue and violet rays usually pass out from the center at the top of the head. When the student has learnt to deflect the orange-red rays so that they also move up through the spine, the empty atoms of both these and the violet-blue rays pour out from the top of the head in a fiery cascade, which is frequently imaged as a flame in ancient statues of the Buddha and other great saints. When empty of the vital force, the atoms are once more precisely like any other atoms. The body absorbs such of them as it needs, so that they form part of the various combinations which are constantly being made, while others which are not required for such purposes are cast out through any channel that happens to be convenient. The flow of vitality into or through any center, or even its intensification, must not be confused with the entirely different development of the center which is brought about by the awakening of the serpent fire at a later stage in man's evolution. We all of us draw in vitality and specialize it, but many of us do not utilize it to the full, because in various ways our lives are not as pure and healthy and reasonable as they should be. One who coarsens his body by the use of meat, alcohol or tobacco can never employ his vitality to the full in the same way as can a man of purer living. A particular individual of impure life may be, and often is stronger in the physical body than certain other men who are pure. That is a matter of their respective karma, but other things being equal, the man of pure life has an immense advantage. Vitality, not magnetism. The vitality coursing along the nerves must not be confused with what we usually call the magnetism of the man, his own nerve fluid, generated within himself. It is this fluid which keeps up the constant circulation of etheric matter along the nerves, corresponding to the circulation of blood through the veins. And as oxygen is conveyed by the blood to all parts of the body, so vitality is conveyed along the nerves by this etheric current. The particles of the etheric part of man's body are constantly changing, just as are those of the denser part. Along with the food which we eat and the air which we breathe, we take in etheric matter, and this is assimilated by the etheric part of the body. Etheric matter is constantly being thrown off from the pores, just as is gaseous matter, so that when two persons are close together each necessarily absorbs much of the physical emanations of the other. When one person mesmerizes another, the operator by an effort of will gathers together a great deal of this magnetism and throws it into the subject, pushing back his victim's nerve fluid, and filling its place with his own. As the brain is the center of this nervous circulation, this brings that part of the subject's body which is affected under the control of the manipulator's brain instead of the victim's. And so the latter feels what the mesmerist wishes him to feel. If the recipient's brain be emptied of his own magnetism and filled with that of the former can think and act only as the latter wills that he should think and act, he is for the time entirely dominated. Even when the magnetizer is trying to cure, and is pouring strength into the man, he inevitably gives along with the vitality much of his own emanations. It is obvious that any disease which the mesmerizer happens to have may readily be conveyed to the subject in this way. And another even more important consideration is that, though his health may be perfect from the medical point of view, there are mental and moral diseases as well as physical, and that, as astral and mental matter are thrown into the subject by the mesmerist along with the physical current, these also are frequently transferred. Vitality, like light and heat, is pouring forth from the sun continually, but obstacles frequently arise to prevent the full supply from reaching the earth. In the wintry and melancholy climes miscalled the temperate, it too often happens that for days together the sky is covered by a funeral pall of heavy cloud, and this affects vitality just as it does light. It does not altogether hinder its passage, but sensibly diminishes its amount. Therefore in dull and dark weather vitality runs low, and over all living creatures there comes an instinctive yearning for sunlight. When vitalist atoms are thus more sparsely scattered, the man in rude health increases his power of absorption, depletes a larger area, and so keeps his strength at the normal level. But invalids and men of small nerve force, who cannot do this, often suffer severely, and find themselves growing weaker and more irritable without knowing why. For similar reasons vitality is at a lower ebb in the winter than in the summer, for even if the short winter day be sunny, which is rare, we have still to face the long and dreary winter night, during which we must exist upon such vitality as the day has stored in our atmosphere. On the other hand, the long summer day, when bright and cloudless, charges the atmosphere so thoroughly with vitality that its short night makes but little difference. From the study of this question of vitality, the occultist cannot fail to recognize that, quite apart from temperature, sunlight is one of the most important factors in the attainment and preservation of perfect health, a factor for the absence of which nothing else can entirely compensate. Since this vitality is poured forth not only upon the physical world but upon all others as well, it is evident that, when in other respects satisfactory conditions are present, emotion, intellect and spirituality will be at their best under clear skies and with the inestimable aid of the sunlight. All the colors of this order of vitality are etheric, yet it will be seen that their action presents certain correspondences with the signification attached to similar hues in the astral body. Clearly right thought and right feeling react upon the physical body, and increase its power to assimilate the vitality which is necessary for its well-being. It is reported that the Lord Buddha once said that the first step on the road to nirvana is perfect physical health, and assuredly the way to attain that is to follow the noble eightfold path which he has indicated. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you, yes, even physical health as well. Chapter 5. By natural surroundings. The weather. The vagaries of the weather are proverbial, and though observation and study of its phenomena enable us to venture upon certain limited predictions, the ultimate cause of most of the changes still escapes us, and will continue to do so until we realize that there are considerations to be taken into account besides the action of heat and cold, of radiation and condensation. The earth itself is living. This ball of matter is being used as a physical body by a vast entity, not an adept or an angel, not a highly developed being at all, but rather something which may be imagined as a kind of gigantic nature spirit, for whom the existence of our earth is one incarnation. His previous incarnation was naturally in the moon, since that was the fourth planet of the last chain. And equally naturally his next incarnation will be in the fourth planet of the chain that will succeed ours when the evolution of our terrestrial chain is completed. Of his nature or the character of his evolution we can know but little, nor does it in any way concern us, for we are to him but as tiny microbes or parasites upon his body, and in all probability he is unaware even of our existence. For nothing that we can do can be on a scale large enough to affect him. For him the atmosphere surrounding the earth must be as a kind of aura, or perhaps rather corresponding to the film of etheric matter which projects ever so slightly beyond the outline of man's dense physical body. And just as any alteration or disturbance in the man affects this film of ether, so must any change of condition in this spirit of the earth affect the atmosphere. Some such changes must be periodic and regular, like the motions produced in us by breathing, by the action of the heart or by an even movement, such as walking. Others must be irregular and occasional, as would be the changes produced in a man by a sudden start, or by an outburst of emotion. We know that violent emotion, astral in its origin though it be, produces chemical changes and variations of temperature in the human physical body. Whatever corresponds to such emotion in the spirit of the earth may well cause chemical changes in his physical body also, and variations of temperature in its immediate surroundings. Now variations of temperature in the atmosphere mean wind. Sudden and violent variations mean storm, and chemical changes beneath the surface of the earth not infrequently cause earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. No student of occultism will fall into the common error of regarding as evil such outbursts as storms or eruptions, because they sometimes destroy human life. For he will recognize that, whatever the immediate cause may be, all that happens is part of the working of the great immutable law of justice, and that he who doeth all things most certainly doeth all things well. This aspect of natural phenomena, however, will be considered in a later chapter. It cannot be questioned that men are much and variously affected by the weather. There is a general consensus of opinion that gloomy weather is depressing. But this is mainly due to the fact that in the absence of sunlight there is, as has already been explained, a lack of vitality. Some people, however, take an actual delight in rain or snow or high wind. There is in these disturbances something which produces a distinct pleasurable sensation which quickens their vibrations and harmonizes with the keynote of their nature. It is probable that this is not entirely or even chiefly due to the physical disturbance. It is rather that the subtle change in the aura of the spirit of the earth, which produces or coincides with this phenomenon, is one with which their spirits are in sympathy. A still more decided instance of this is the effect of a thunderstorm. There are many people in whom it produces a curious sense of overwhelming fear entirely out of proportion to any physical danger that it can be supposed to bring. In others, on the contrary, the electrical storm produces wild exultation. The influence of electricity on the physical nerves no doubt plays a part in producing these unusual sensations, but their true cause lies deeper than that. The effect produced upon people by these various manifestations depends upon the preponderance in their temperament of certain types of elemental essence which, because of this sympathetic vibration, used to be called by medieval inquirers earthy, watery, airy, or fiery. Exactly in the same way the effect of the various sections of our surroundings will be greater or less upon men according as they have more or less of one or other of these constituents in their composition. To the man who responds most readily to earth influences, the nature of the soil upon which his house is built is of primary importance, but it matters comparatively little to him whether it is or is not in the neighborhood of water. Whereas the man who responds most readily to the radiations of water would care little about the soil so long as he had the ocean or a lake within sight and within easy reach. Rocks. Influence is perpetually radiated upon us by all objects of nature, even by the very earth upon which we tread. Each type of rock or soil has its own special variety, and the differences between them are great, so that their effect is by no means to be neglected. In the production of this effect three factors bear their part: the life of the rock itself, the kind of elemental essence appropriate to its astral counterpart, and the kind of nature spirits which it attracts. The life of the rock is simply the life of the second great outpouring which has arrived at the stage of ensouling the mineral kingdom, and the elemental essence is a later wave of that same divine life which is one chain period behind the other, and has yet in its descent into matter reached only the astral world. The nature spirit belonged to a different evolution altogether, to which we shall refer in due course. The point for us to bear in mind for the moment is that each kind of soil, granite or sandstone, chalk, clay or lava, has its definite influence upon those who live on it, an influence which never ceases. Night and day, summer and winter, year in and year out, this steady pressure is being exercised, and it has its part in the molding of races and districts, types as well as individuals. All these matters are as yet but little comprehended by ordinary science, but there can be no doubt that in time to come these effects will be thoroughly studied, and the doctors of the future will take them into account, and prescribe a change of soil as well as of air for their patients. An entirely new and distinct set of agencies is brought into play wherever water exists, whether it be in the form of lake, river, or sea, powerful in different ways in all of them truly, but most powerful and observable in the last. Here also the same three factors have to be considered: the life of the water itself, the elemental essence pervading it, and the type of nature spirits associated with it. Trees. Strong influences are radiated by the vegetable kingdom also, and the different kinds of plants and trees vary greatly in their effect. Those who have not specially studied the subject invariably underrate the strength, capacity, and intelligence shown in vegetable life. I have already written upon this in the Christian Creed, p. 51, 2nd edition, so I will not repeat myself here, but will rather draw attention to the fact that trees, especially old trees, have a strong and definite individuality, well worthy the name of a soul. This soul, though temporary, in the sense that it is not yet a reincarnating entity, is nevertheless possessed of considerable power and intelligence along its own lines. It has decided likes and dislikes, and to clairvoyant sight it shows quite clearly by a vivid rosy flush and emphatic enjoyment of the sunlight and the rain, and distinct pleasure also in the presence of those whom it has learnt to like, or with whom it has sympathetic vibrations. Emerson appears to have realized this, for he is quoted in Hutton's Reminiscences as saying of his trees, "I am sure they miss me. They seem to droop when I go away, and I know they brighten and bloom when I go back to them and shake hands with their lower branches." An old forest tree is a high development of vegetable life, and when it is transferred from that kingdom it does not pass into the lowest form of animal life. In some cases its individuality is even sufficiently distinct to allow it to manifest itself temporarily outside its physical form, and when that is so it often takes the human shape. Matters may be otherwise arranged in other solar systems for aught we know, but in ours the deity has chosen the human form to enshrine the highest intelligence, to be carried on to the utmost perfection as his scheme develops, and because that is so, there is always a tendency among lower kinds of life to reach upwards towards that form, and in their primitive way to imagine themselves as possessing it. Thus it happens that such creatures as gnomes or elves, whose bodies are of fluidic nature, of astral or etheric matter which is plastic under the influence of the will, habitually adopt some approximation to the appearance of humanity. Thus also when it is possible for the soul of a tree to externalize itself and become visible, it is almost always in human shape that it is seen. Doubtless these were the dryads of classical times. And the occasional appearance of such figures may account for the widely spread custom of tree worship. Omni ignotum pro magnifico. And if primitive man saw a huge, grave human form come forth from a tree, he was likely enough in his ignorance to set up an altar there and worship it, not in the least understanding that he himself stood far higher in evolution than it did, and that its very assumption of his image was an acknowledgment of that fact. The occult side of the instinct of a plant is also exceedingly interesting. Its one great object, like that of some human beings, is always to found a family and reproduce its species. And it has certainly a feeling of active enjoyment in its success, in the color and beauty of its flowers and in their efficiency in attracting bees and other insects. Unquestionably plants feel admiration lavished upon them and delight in it. They are sensitive to human affection and they return it in their own way. When all this is borne in mind, it will readily be understood that trees exercise much more influence over human beings than is commonly supposed, and that he who sets himself to cultivate sympathetic and friendly relations with all his neighbors, vegetable as well as animal and human, may both receive and give a great deal of which the average man knows nothing, and may thus make his life fuller, wider, more complete. The 7 types. The classification of the vegetable kingdom adopted by the occultist follows the line of the 7 great types mentioned in our previous chapter on planetary influences, and each of these is divided into 7 subtypes. If we imagine ourselves trying to tabulate the vegetable kingdom, these divisions would naturally be perpendicular, nor horizontal. We should not have trees as one type, shrubs as another, ferns as a third, grasses or mosses as a fourth. Rather we should find trees, shrubs, ferns, grasses, mosses of each of the 7 types, so that along each line all the steps of the ascending scale are represented. One might phrase it that when the second outpouring is ready to descend, 7 great channels, each with its 7 subdivisions, lie open for its choice. But the channel through which it passes gives it a certain coloring, a set of temperamental characteristics, which it never wholly loses, so that although in order to express itself it needs matter belonging to all the different types, it has always a preponderance of its own type, and always recognizably belongs to that type and no other. Until after its evolution is over it returns as a glorified spiritual power to the deity from whom it originally emerged as a mere undeveloped potentiality. The vegetable kingdom is only one stage in this stupendous course, yet these different types are distinguishable in it, just as they are among animals or human beings, and each has its own special influence, which may be soothing or helpful to one man, distressing or irritating to another, and inert in the case of a third, according to his type and to his condition at the time. Training and practice are necessary to enable the student to assign the various plants and trees to their proper classes, but the distinction between the magnetism radiated by the oak and the pine, the palm tree and the banyan, the olive and the eucalyptus, the rose and the lily, the violet and the sunflower, cannot fail to be obvious to any sensitive person. Wide as the poles asunder is the dissimilarity between the feeling of an English forest and a tropical jungle, or the bush of Australia or New Zealand. Animals. For thousands of years man has lived so cruelly that all wild creatures fear and avoid him, so the influence upon him of the animal kingdom is practically confined to that of the domestic animals. In our relations with these our influence over them is naturally far more potent than theirs over us, yet this latter is by no means to be ignored. A man who has really made friends with an animal is often much helped and strengthened by the affection lavished upon him. Being more advanced, a man is naturally capable of greater love than an animal is. But the animal's affection is usually more concentrated, and he is far more likely to throw the whole of his energy into it than a man is. The very fact of the man's higher development gives him a multiplicity of interests, among which his attention is divided. The animal often pours the entire strength of his nature into one channel, and so produces a most powerful effect. The man has 100 other matters to think about, and the current of his love consequently cannot but be variable. When the dog or the cat develops a really great affection it fills the whole of his life, and he therefore keeps a steady stream of force always playing upon its object, a factor whose value is by no means to be ignored. Similarly the man who is so wicked as to provoke by cruelty the hatred and fear of domestic animals becomes by a righteous retribution the center of converging forces of antipathy. For such conduct arouses deep indignation among nature spirits and other astral and etheric entities, as well as among all right-minded men, whether living or dead. Human beings. Since it is emphatically true that no man can afford to be disliked or feared by his cat or dog, it is clear that the same consideration applies with still greater force to the human beings who surround him. It is not easy to overestimate the importance to a man of winning the kindly regard of those with whom he is in constant association, to overrate the value to a schoolmaster of the attitude towards him of his pupils, to a merchant of the feeling of his clerks, to an officer of the devotion of his men. And this entirely apart from the obvious effects produced in the physical world. If a man holding any such position as one of these is able to arouse the enthusiastic affection of his subordinates, he becomes the focus upon which many streams of such forces are constantly converging. Not only does this greatly uplift and strengthen him, but it also enables him, if he understands something of the working of occult laws, to be of far greater use to those who feel the affection, and to do much more with them than would otherwise be possible. To obtain this result it is not in the least necessary that they should agree with him in opinion, with the particular effect with which we are at present concerned their mental attitude has no connection whatever. It is a matter of strong, kindly feeling. If the feeling should unfortunately be of an opposite kind, if the man is feared or despised, currents of antipathy are perpetually flowing towards him, which cause weakness and discord in the vibrations of his higher vehicles, and also cut him off from the possibility of doing satisfactory and fruitful work with those under his charge. It is not only the force of the feeling sent out by the person, like attracts like in the astral world as well as the physical. There are always masses of vague thought floating about in the atmosphere, some of them good and some evil, but all alike ready to reinforce any decided thought of their own type. Also there are nature spirits of low order, which enjoy the coarse vibrations of anger and hatred, and are therefore very willing to throw themselves into any current of such nature. By doing so they intensify the undulations, and add fresh life to them. All this tends to strengthen the effect produced by the converging streams of unfavorable thought and feeling. It has been said that a man is known by the company he keeps. It is also to a large extent true that he is made by it, for those with whom he constantly associates are all the while unconsciously influencing him and bringing him by degrees more and more into harmony with such undulations as they radiate. He who is much in the presence of a large-minded and unworldly man has a fine opportunity of himself becoming large-minded and unworldly, for a steady though imperceptible pressure in that direction is perpetually being exerted upon him, so that it is easier for him to grow in that way than in any other. For the same reason a man who spends his time loafing in a public house with the idle and various is exceedingly likely to end by becoming idle and vicious himself. The study of the hidden side of things emphatically endorses the old proverb that evil communications corrupt good manners. This fact of the enormous influence of close association with a more advanced personality is well understood in the East, where it is recognized that the most important and effective part of the training of a disciple is that he shall live constantly in the presence of his teacher and bathe in his aura. The various vehicles of the teacher are all vibrating with a steady and powerful swing at rates both higher and more regular than any which the pupil can yet maintain, though he may sometimes reach them for a few moments. But the constant pressure of the stronger thought waves of the teacher gradually raises those of the pupil into the same key. A person who has as yet but little musical ear finds it difficult to sing correct intervals alone, but if he joins with another stronger voice which is already perfectly trained, his task becomes easier, which may serve as a kind of rough analogy. The great point is that the dominant note of the teacher is always sounding, so that its action is affecting the pupil night and day without need of any special thought on the part of either of them. Growth and change must of course be ceaselessly taking place in the vehicles of the pupil, as in those of all other men. But the powerful undulations emanating from the teacher render it easy for this growth to take place in the right direction, and exceedingly difficult for it to go any other way. Somewhat as the splints which surround a broken limb ensure that its growth shall be only in the right line, so as to avoid distortion. No ordinary man, acting automatically and without intention, will be able to exercise even 100th part of the carefully directed influence of a spiritual teacher. But numbers may to some extent compensate for lack of individual power, so that the ceaseless though unnoticed pressure exercised upon us by the opinions and feelings of our associates leads us frequently to absorb without knowing it many of their prejudices. It is distinctly undesirable that a man should remain always among one set of people and hear only one set of views. It is eminently necessary that he should know something of other sets, for only in that way can he learn to see good in all. Only thoroughly understanding both sides of any case can he form an opinion that has any right to be called a real judgment. The prejudiced person is always and necessarily an ignorant person. And the only way in which his ignorance can be dispelled is by getting outside his own narrow little circle, and learning to look at things for himself and see what they really are, not what those who know nothing about them suppose them to be. Travel. The extent to which our human surroundings influence us is only realized when we change them for a while, and the most effective method of doing this is to travel in a foreign country. But true travel is not to rush from one gigantic caravanserai to another, consorting all the time with one foot's own countrymen, and grumbling at every custom which differs from those of our particular little Pedlington. It is rather to live for a time quietly in some foreign land, trying to get really to know its people and to understand them. To study a custom and see why it has arisen, and what good there is in it, instead of condemning it offhand because it is not our own. The man who does this will soon come to recognize the characteristic traits of the various races, to comprehend such fundamental diversities as those between the English and the Irish, the Hindu and the American, the Breton and the Sicilian. And yet to realize that they are to be looked upon not as one better than another, but as the different colors that go to make up the rainbow, the different movements that are all necessary, as parts of the great oratorio of life. Each has its part to play in affording opportunity for the evolution of egos who need just its influence, who are lacking in just its characteristics. Each race has behind it a mighty angel, the spirit of the race, who under the direction of the Manu preserves its special qualities and guides it along the line destined for it. A new race is born when in the scheme of evolution a new type of temperament is needed. A race dies out when all the egos who can be benefited by it have passed through it. The influence of the spirit of a race thoroughly permeates the country or district over which his supervision extends, and is naturally a factor of the greatest importance to any visitor who is in the least sensitive. The ordinary tourist is too often imprisoned in the triple armor of aggressive race prejudice, He is so full of conceit over the supposed excellencies of his own nation that he is incapable of seeing good in any other. The wiser traveler, who is willing to open his heart to the action of higher forces, may receive from this source much that is valuable, both of instruction and experience. But in order to do that, he must begin by putting himself in the right attitude. He must be ready to listen rather than to talk, to learn rather than to boast, to appreciate rather than to criticize, to try to understand rather than rashly to condemn. To achieve such a result is the true object of travel, and we have a far better opportunity for this than was afforded to our forefathers. Methods of communication are so much improved that it is now possible for almost anyone to achieve quickly and cheaply journeys that would have been entirely impossible a century ago, except for the rich and leisured class. Along with these possibilities of intercommunication has come the wide dissemination of foreign news by means of the telegraph and the newspaper press. So that even those who do not actually leave their own country still know much more about others than was ever possible before. Without all these facilities there never could have been a theosophical society, or at least it could not have had its present character, nor could it have reached its present level of effectiveness. The first object of the Theosophical Society is the promotion of universal brotherhood, and nothing helps so much to induce brotherly feeling between nations as full and constant intercourse with one another. When people know one another only by hearsay, all sorts of absurd prejudices grow up, but when they come to know one another intimately, each finds that the other is after all a human being much like himself, with the same interests and objects, the same joys and sorrows. In the old days each nation lived to a large extent in a condition of selfish isolation, and if trouble of some sort fell upon one, it had usually no resources but its own upon which it could depend. Now the whole world is so closely drawn together that if there is a famine in India help is sent from America, if an earthquake devastates one of the countries of Europe, subscriptions for the sufferers pour in at once from all the others. However far away as yet may be the perfect realization of universal brotherhood, it is clear that we are at least drawing nearer to it. We have not yet learned entirely to trust one another, but at least we are ready to help one another, and that is already a long step upon the roads towards becoming really one family. We know how often travel is recommended as a cure for many physical ills, especially for those which manifest themselves through the various forms of nervous derangement. Most of us find it to be fatiguing, yet also undeniably exhilarating, though we do not always realize that this is not only because of the change of air and of the ordinary physical impressions, but also because of the change of the etheric and astral influences which are connected with each place and district. Ocean, mountain, forest or waterfall each has its own special type of life, astral and etheric as well as visible, and, therefore, its own special set of impressions and influences. Many of these unseen entities are pouring out vitality, and in any case, the vibrations which they radiate awaken unaccustomed portions of our etheric double, and of our astral and mental bodies. And the effect is like the exercise of muscles which are not ordinarily called into activity, somewhat tiring at the time, yet distinctly healthy and desirable in the long run. The town dweller is accustomed to his surroundings, and usually does not realize the horror of them until he leaves them for a time. To dwell beside a busy main street is from the astral point of view like living on the brink of an open sewer, a river of fetid mud which is always throwing up splashes and noisome odors as it rolls along. No man, however unimpressionable, can endure this indefinitely without deterioration, and an occasional change into the country is a necessity on the ground of moral as well as physical health. In traveling from the town into the country, too, we leave behind us to a great extent the stormy sea of warring human passion and labor. And such human thoughts as still remain to act upon us are usually of the less selfish and more elevated kind. In the presence of one of nature's great wonders, such as the Falls of Niagara, almost everyone is for the time drawn out of himself, and out of the petty round of daily care and selfish desire, so that his thought is nobler and broader. And the thought forms which he leaves behind him are correspondingly less disturbing and more helpful. These considerations once more make it evident that in order to obtain the full benefit of travel a man must pay attention to nature and allow it to act upon him. If he is wrapped up all the while in selfish and gloomy thoughts, crushed by financial trouble, or brooding over his own sickness and weakness, little benefit can be derived from the healing influences. Another point is that certain places are permeated by certain special types of thought. The consideration of this matter belongs rather to another chapter, but we may introduce it so far as to mention that the frame of mind in which people habitually visit a certain place reacts strongly upon all the other visitors to it. Popular seaside resorts in England have about them an air of buoyancy and irresponsibility, a determined feeling of holiday life, of temporary freedom from business and of the resolution to make the most of it, from the influence of which it is difficult to escape. Thus the jaded and overworked man who spends his well-earned holiday in such a place, obtains quite a different result from that which would follow if he simply stayed quietly at home. To sit at home would probably be less fatiguing, but also much less stimulating. To take a country walk is to travel in miniature, and in order to appreciate its healthful effect we must bear in mind what has been said of all the different vibrations issuing from various kinds of trees or plants, and even from different kinds of soil or rock. All these act as kind of massage upon the etheric, astral and mental bodies, and tend to relieve the strain which the worries of our common life persistently exert upon certain parts of these vehicles. Glimpses of the truth on these points may sometimes be caught from the traditions of the peasantry. For example, there is a widely spread belief that strength may be gained from sleeping under a pine tree with the head to the north. For some cases this is suitable, and the rationale of it is that there are magnetic currents always flowing over the surface of the earth which are quite unknown to ordinary men. These by steady, gentle pressure gradually comb out the entanglements and strengthen the particles both of the astral body and of the etheric part of the physical, and thus bring them more into harmony and introduce rest and calm. The part played by the pine tree is, first, that its radiations make the man sensitive to those magnetic currents, and bring him into a state in which it is possible for them to act upon him, and secondly, that, as has already been explained, it is constantly throwing off vitality in that special condition in which it is easiest for man to absorb it. Chapter 6. By Nature Spirits. An evolution apart. Another factor which exercises great influence under certain restrictions is the nature spirit. We may regard the nature spirits of the land as in a sense the original inhabitants of the country, driven away from some parts of it by the invasion of man, much as the wild animals have been. Just like wild animals, the nature spirits avoid altogether the great cities and all places where men most do congregate, so that in those their effect is a negligible quantity. But in all quiet country places, among the woods and fields, upon the mountains or out at sea, nature spirits are constantly present, and though they rarely show themselves, their influence is powerful and all-pervading. Just as the scent of the violets fills the air though they are hidden modestly among the leaves. The nature spirits constitute an evolution apart, quite distinct at this stage from that of humanity. We are familiar with the course taken by the second outpouring through the three elemental kingdoms, down to the mineral and upward through the vegetable and animal, to the attainment of individuality at the human level. We know that, after that individuality has been attained, the unfolding of humanity carries us gradually to the steps of the path, and then onward and upward to adeptship and to the glorious possibilities which lie beyond. This is our line of development, but we must not make the mistake of thinking of it as the only line. Even in this world of ours the divine life is pressing upwards through several streams, of which ours is but one, and numerically by no means the most important. It may help us to realize this if we remember that while humanity in its physical manifestation occupies only quite a small part of the surface of the earth, entities at a corresponding level on other lines of evolution not only crowd the earth far more thickly than man, but at the same time populate the enormous plains of the sea and the fields of the air. Lines of evolution. At this present stage we find these streams running parallel to one another, but for the time quite distinct. The nature spirits, for example, neither have been nor ever will be members of a humanity such as ours, yet the indwelling life of the nature spirit comes from the same solar deity as our own, and will return to him just as ours will. The streams may be roughly considered as flowing side by side as far as the mineral level, but as soon as they turn to commence the upward arc of evolution, divergence begins to appear. This stage of immortalization is naturally that at which life is most deeply immersed in physical matter, but while some of the streams retain physical forms through several of the further stages of their development, making them, as they proceed, more and more an expression of the life within, there are other streams which at once begin to cast off the grosser, and for the rest of their unfolding in this world use only bodies composed of etheric matter. One of these streams, for example, after finishing that stage of its evolvement in which it is part of the mineral monad, instead of passing into the vegetable kingdom, takes for itself vehicles of etheric matter which inhabit the interior of the earth, living actually within the solid rock. It is difficult for many students to understand how it is possible for any kind of creature thus to inhabit the solid substance of the rock or the crust of the earth. Creatures possessing bodies of etheric matter find the substance of the rock no impediment to their motion or their vision. Indeed, for them physical matter in its solid state is their natural element and habitat, the only one to which they are accustomed and in which they feel at home. These vague lower lives in amorphous etheric vehicles are not readily comprehensible to us. But somehow they gradually evolve to a stage when, though still inhabiting the solid rock, they live close to the surface of the earth instead of in its depths. And the more developed of them are able occasionally to detach themselves from it for a short time. These creatures have sometimes been seen, and perhaps more frequently heard, in caves or mines, and they are often described in medieval literature as gnomes. The etheric matter of their bodies is not, under ordinary conditions, visible to physical eyes, so that when they are seen one of two things must take place. Either they must materialize themselves by drawing round them a veil of physical matter, or else the spectator must experience an increase of sensitiveness which enables him to respond to the wavelengths of the higher ethers, and to see what is not normally perceptible to him. The slight temporary exaltation of faculty necessary for this is not very uncommon nor difficult to achieve, and on the other hand materialization is easy for creatures which are only just beyond the bounds of visibility, so that they would be seen far more frequently than they are, but for the rooted objection to the proximity of human beings which they share with all but the lowest types of nature spirits. The next stage of their advancement brings them into the subdivision commonly called fairies, the type of nature spirits which usually live upon the surface of the earth as we do, though still using only an etheric body. And after that they pass on through the air spirits into the kingdom of the angels in a way which will be explained later. The life wave which is at the mineral level is manifesting itself not only through the rocks which form the solid crust of the earth, but also through the waters of the ocean. And just as the former may pass through low etheric forms of life, at present unknown to man, in the interior of the earth, so the latter may pass through corresponding low etheric forms which have their dwelling in the depths of the sea. In this case also the next stage or kingdom brings us into more definite though still etheric forms inhabiting the middle depths, and very rarely showing themselves at the surface. The third stage for them, corresponding to that of the fairies for the rock spirits, is to join the enormous host of water spirits which cover the vast plains of the ocean with their joyous life. Taking as they do bodies of etheric matter only, it will be seen that the entities following these lines of development miss altogether the vegetable and animal kingdoms as well the human. There are, however, other types of nature spirits which enter into both these kingdoms before they begin to diverge. In the ocean, for example, there is a stream of life which, after leaving the mineral level, touches the vegetable kingdom in the form of seaweeds, and then passes on, through the corals and the sponges and the huge cephalopods of the middle deeps, up into the great family of the fishes, and only after that joins the ranks of water spirits. It will be seen that these retain the dense physical body as a vehicle up to a much higher level. And in the same way we notice that the fairies of the land are recruited not only from the ranks of the gnomes, but also from the less evolved strata of the animal kingdom. For we find a line of development which just touches the vegetable kingdom in the shape of minute fungoid growths, and then passes onward through bacteria and animalculae of various kinds, through the insects and reptiles up to the beautiful family of the birds, and only after many incarnations among these joins the still more joyous tribe of the fairies. Yet another stream diverges into etheric life at an intermediate point, for while it comes up through the vegetable kingdom in the shape of grasses and cereals, It turns aside thence into the animal kingdom and is conducted through the curious communities of the ants and bees. And then through a set of etheric creatures closely corresponding to the latter, those tiny hummingbird-like nature spirits which are so continually seen hovering about flowers and plants, and play so large a part in the production of their manifold variations, their playfulness being often utilized in specialization and in the helping of growth. It is necessary, however, to draw a careful distinction here, to avoid confusion. The little creatures that look after flowers may be divided into two great classes, though of course there are many varieties of each kind. The first class may properly be called elementals, for beautiful though they are in reality only thought forms, and therefore they are not really living creatures at all. Perhaps I should rather say that they are only temporarily living creatures, for though they are very active and busy during their little lives, they have no real evolving, reincarnating life in them, and when they have done their work, they just go to pieces and dissolve into the surrounding atmosphere, precisely as our own thought forms do. They are the thought forms of the great beings or angels who are in charge of the evolution of the vegetable kingdom. When one of these great ones has a new idea connected with one of the kinds of plants or flowers which are under his charge, he often creates a thought form for the special purpose of carrying out that idea. It usually takes the form either of an etheric model of the flower itself or of a little creature which hangs round the plant or the flower all through the time that the buds are forming, and gradually builds them into the shape and color of which the angel has thought. But as soon as the plant has fully grown, or the flower has opened, its work is over and its power is exhausted, and, as I have said, it just simply dissolves, because the will to do that piece of work was the only soul that it had. But there is quite another kind of little creature which is very frequently seen playing about with flowers, and this time it is a real nature spirit. There are many varieties of these also. One of the commonest forms is, as I have said, something very much like a tiny hummingbird, and it may often be seen buzzing round the flowers much in the same way as a hummingbird or a bee does. These beautiful little creatures will never become human, because they are not in the same line of evolution as we are. The life which is now animating them has come up through grasses and cereals, such as wheat and oats, when it was in the vegetable kingdom, and afterwards through ants and bees when it was in the animal kingdom. Now it has reached the level of these tiny nature spirits, and its next stage will be to ensoul some of the beautiful fairies with etheric bodies who live upon the surface of the earth. Later on they will become salamanders or fire spirits, and later still they will become sylphs, or air spirits, having only astral bodies instead of etheric. Later still they will pass through the different stages of the great kingdom of the angels. Overlapping. In all cases of the transference of the life wave from one kingdom to another, great latitude is allowed for variation. There is a good deal of overlapping between the kingdoms. That is perhaps most clearly to be seen along our own line of evolution, for we find that the life which has attained to the highest levels in the vegetable kingdom never passes into the lower part of the animal kingdom at all, but on the contrary joins it at a fairly advanced stage. Let me recall the example which I have already given. The life which has ensouled one of our great forest trees could never descend to animate a swarm of mosquitoes, nor even a family of rats or mice or such small deer, while these latter would be quite appropriate forms for that part of the life wave which had left the vegetable kingdom at the level of the daisy or the dandelion. The ladder of evolution has to be climbed in all cases, but it seems as though the higher part of one kingdom lies to a large extent parallel with the lower part of that above it, so that it is possible for a transfer from one to the other to take place at different levels in different cases. That stream of life which enters the human kingdom avoids altogether the lowest stages of the animal kingdom, that is, the life which is presently to rise into humanity never manifests itself through the insects or the reptiles. In the past it did sometimes enter the animal kingdom at the level of the great antediluvian reptiles, but now it passes directly from the highest forms of the vegetable life into the mammalia. Similarly, when the most advanced domestic animal becomes individualized, he does not need to descend into the form of the absolutely primitive savage for his first human incarnation. The accompanying diagram shows some of these lines of development in a convenient tabular form, but it must not be considered as in any way exhaustive, as there are no doubt other lines which have not yet been observed. And there are certainly all kinds of variations and possibilities of crossing at different levels from one line to another. So that all we can do is to give a broad outline of the scheme. As will be seen from the diagram, at a later stage all the lines of evolution converge once more. At least to our dim sight there seems no distinction of glory among those lofty ones, though probably if we knew more we could make our table more complete. At any rate we know that, much as humanity lies above the animal kingdom, so beyond and above humanity in its turn lies the great kingdom of the angels. And that to enter among the angels is one of the 7 possibilities which the adept finds opening before him. That same kingdom is also the next stage for the nature spirit, but we have here another instance of the overlapping previously mentioned, for the adept joins that kingdom at a high level, omitting altogether 3 of its stages. While the next step of progress for the highest type of nature spirit is to become the lowest class of angel, thus beginning at the bottom of that particular ladder instead of stepping on to it halfway up. It is on joining the angel kingdom that the nature spirit receives the divine spark of the third outpouring, and thus attains individuality, just as the animal does when he passes into the human kingdom. And a further point of similarity is that just as the animal gains individualization only through contact with humanity, so the nature spirit gains it through contact with the angel, through becoming attached to him and working in order to please him, until at last he learns how to do angel's work himself. The more advanced nature spirit is therefore not exactly an etheric or astral human being, for he is not yet an individual. Yet he is much more than an etheric or astral animal, for his intellectual level is far higher than anything which we find in the animal kingdom, and is indeed quite equal along many lines to that of average humanity. On the other hand, some of the earlier varieties possess but a limited amount of intelligence, and seem to be about on an equality with the hummingbirds or bees or butterflies which they so closely resemble. As we have seen from our diagram, this one name of nature spirit covers a large segment of the arc of evolution, including stages corresponding to the whole of the vegetable and animal kingdoms, and to humanity up to almost the present level of our own race. Some of the lower types are not pleasing to the aesthetic sense, but that is true also of the lower kinds of reptiles and insects. There are undeveloped tribes whose tastes are coarse, and naturally their appearance corresponds to the stage of their evolution. The shapeless masses with huge red gaping mouths, which live upon the loathsome etheric emanations of blood and decaying flesh, are horrible both to the sight and to the feeling of any pure-minded person. So also are the rapacious red-brown crustacean creatures which hover over houses of ill fame, and the savage octopus-like monsters which gloat over the orgies of the drunkard and revel in the fumes of alcohol. But even these harpies are not evil in themselves, though repulsive to man, and man would never come into contact with them unless he degraded himself to their level by becoming the slave of his lower passions. It is only nature spirits of these and similar primitive and unpleasant kinds which voluntarily approach the average man. Others of the same sort, but a shade less material, enjoy the sensation of bathing in any specially coarse astral radiations, such as those produced by anger, avarice, cruelty, jealousy and hatred. People yielding themselves to such feelings can depend upon being constantly surrounded by these carrion crows of the astral world, who quiver in their ghastly glee as they jostle one another in eager anticipation of an outburst of passion, and in their blind, blundering way do whatever they can to provoke or intensify it. It is difficult to believe that such horrors as these can belong to the same kingdom as the jocund spirits next to be described. Fairies. The type best known to man is that of the fairies, the spirits who live normally upon the surface of the earth, though, since their bodies are of etheric matter, they can pass into the ground at will. Their forms are many and various, but most frequently human in shape and somewhat diminutive in size, usually with a grotesque exaggeration of some particular feature or limb. Etheric matter being plastic and readily molded by the power of thought, they are able to assume almost any appearance at will, but they nevertheless have definite forms of their own, which they wear when they have no special object to serve by taking any other, and are therefore not exerting their will to produce a change of shape. They have also colors of their own, marking the difference between their tribes or species, just as the birds have differences of plumage. There are an immense number of subdivisions or races among them, and individuals of these subdivisions vary in intelligence and disposition precisely as human beings do. Again, like human beings, these diverse races inhabit different countries, or sometimes different districts of the same country, and the members of one race have a general tendency to keep together, just as men of one nation do among ourselves. They are on the whole distributed much as are the other kingdoms of nature. Like the birds, from whom some of them have been evolved, some varieties are peculiar to one country, others are common in one country and rare elsewhere, while others again are to be found almost anywhere. Again, like the birds, it is broadly true that the most brilliantly colored orders are to be found in tropical countries. National types. The predominant types of the different parts of the world are usually clearly distinguishable and in a sense characteristic. Or is it perhaps that their influence in the slow course of ages has molded the men and animals and plants who live near them, so that it is the nature spirit who has set the fashion and the other kingdoms which have unconsciously followed it? For example, no contrast could well be more marked than that between the vivacious, rollicking, orange and purple or scarlet and gold mannikins who dance among the vineyards of Sicily and the almost wistful grey and green creatures who move so much more sedately amidst the oaks and the furze-covered heaths in Brittany. Or the golden brown, good people, who haunt the hillsides of Scotland. In England the emerald green variety is probably the commonest, and I have seen it also in the woods of France and Belgium, in faraway Massachusetts and on the banks of the Niagara River. The vast plains of the Dakotas are inhabited by a black and white kind which I have not seen elsewhere, and California rejoices in a lovely white and gold species which also appears to be unique. In Australia the most frequent type is a very distinctive creature of a wonderful luminous sky blue color, but there is a wide diversity between the etheric inhabitants of New South Wales or Victoria and those of tropical northern Queensland. These latter approximate closely to those of the Dutch Indies. Java seems specially prolific in these graceful creatures, and the kinds most common there are two distinct types, both monochromatic, one indigo blue with faint metallic gleamings, and the other a study in all known shades of yellow, quaint, but wonderfully effective and attractive. A striking local variety is gaudily ringed with alternate bars of green and yellow, like a football jersey. This ring type is possibly a race peculiar to that part of the world, for I saw red and yellow similarly arranged in the Malay Peninsula, and green and white on the other side of the straits in Sumatra. That huge island also rejoices in the possession of a lovely pale heliotrope tribe which I have seen before only in the hills of Ceylon. Down in New Zealand their specialty is a deep blue shot with silver, while in the South Sea Islands one meets with a silvery white variety which coruscates with all the colors of the rainbow, like a figure of mother of pearl. In India we find all sorts, from the delicate rose and pale green, or pale blue and primrose of the hill country to the rich medley of gorgeously gleaming colors, almost barbaric in their intensity and profusion, which is characteristic of the plains. In some parts of that marvelous country I have seen the black and gold type which is more usually associated with the African desert, and also a species which resembles a statuette made out of a gleaming crimson metal, such as was the orichalcum of the Atlanteans. Somewhat akin to this last is a curious variety which looks as though cast out of bronze and burnished. It appears to make its home in the immediate neighborhood of volcanic disturbances, since the only places in which it has been seen so far are the slopes of Vesuvius and Etna, the interior of Java, the Sandwich Islands, the Yellowstone Park in North America, and a certain part of the North Island of New Zealand. Several indications seem to point to the conclusion that this is a survival of a primitive type, and represents a sort of intermediate stage between the gnome and the fairy. In some cases, districts close together are found to be inhabited by quite different classes of nature spirits. For example, as has already been mentioned, the emerald green elves are common in Belgium, yet 100 miles away in Holland hardly one of them is to be seen, and their place is taken by a sober-looking dark purple species on a sacred mountain in Ireland. A curious fact is that altitude above the sea level seems to affect their distribution, those who belong to the mountains scarcely ever intermingling with those of the plains. I well remember, when climbing Slieve Naaman, one of the traditionally sacred hills of Ireland, noticing the very definite lines of demarcation between the different types. The lower slopes, like the surrounding plains, were alive with the intensely active and mischievous little red and black race which swarms all over the south and west of Ireland. Being especially attracted to the magnetic centers established nearly 2,000 years ago by the magic-working priests of the old Milesian race to ensure and perpetuate their domination over the people by keeping them under the influence of the Great Illusion. After half an hour's climbing, however, not one of these red and black gentry was to be seen, but instead the hillside was populous with the gentler blue and brown type which long ago owed special allegiance to the Tuatha De Danann. These also had their zone and their well-defined limits, and no nature spirit of either type ever ventured to trespass upon the space round the summit, sacred to the great green angels who have watched there for more than 2,000 years. Guarding one of the centers of living force that linked the past to the future of that mystic land of Erin. Taller far than the height of man, these giant forms, in color like the first new leaves of spring, soft, luminous, shimmering, indescribable, look forth over the world with wondrous eyes that shine like stars. Full of the peace of those who live in the eternal, waiting with the calm certainty of knowledge until the appointed time shall come. One realizes very fully the power and importance of the hidden side of things when one beholds such a spectacle as that. But indeed it is scarcely hidden, for the different influences are so strong and so distinct that anyone in the least sensitive cannot but be aware of them. And there is good reason for the local tradition that he who spends a night upon the summit of the mountain shall awaken in the morning either a poet or a madman. A poet, if he has proved capable of response to the exaltation of the whole being produced by the tremendous magnetism which has played upon him while he slept; a madman, if he was not strong enough to bear the strain. Fairy life and death. The life periods of the different subdivisions of nature spirits vary greatly, some being quite short, others much longer than our human lifetime. The universal principle of reincarnation obtains in their existence also, though the conditions naturally make its working slightly different. They have no phenomena corresponding to what we mean by birth and growth. A fairy appears in his world full-sized, as an insect does. He lives his life, short or long, without any appearance of fatigue or need of rest, and without any perceptible signs of age as the years pass. But at last there comes a time when his energy seems to have exhausted itself, when he becomes somewhat tired of life. And when that happens his body grows more and more diaphanous until he is left as an astral entity, to live for a time in that world among the air spirits who represent the next stage of development for him. Through that astral life he fades back into his group soul, in which he may have, if sufficiently advanced, a certain amount of conscious existence before the cyclic law acts upon the group soul once more by arousing in it the desire for separation. When this happens, its pressure turns the stream of its energy outward once more, and that desire, acting upon the plastic astral and etheric matter, materializes a body of similar type, such as is suitable to be an expression of the development attained in that last life. Birth and death, therefore, are much simpler for the nature spirit than for us, and death is for him quite free from all thought of sorrow. Indeed, his whole life seems simpler, a joyous, irresponsible kind of existence, much such as a party of happy children might lead among exceptionally favorable physical surroundings. There is no sex among nature spirits, there is no disease, and there is no struggle for existence, so that they are exempt from the most fertile causes of human suffering. They have keen affections and are capable of forming close and lasting friendships, from which they derive profound and never-failing joy. Jealousy and anger are possible to them, but seem quickly to fade before the overwhelming delight in all the operations of nature which is their most prominent characteristic. Their pleasures. They glory in the light and glow of the sunshine, but they dance with equal pleasure in the moonlight. They share and rejoice in the satisfaction of the thirsty earth and the flowers and the trees when they feel the level lances of the rain, but they play just as happily with the falling flakes of snow. They are content to float idly in the calm of a summer afternoon, yet they revel in the rushing of the wind. Not only do they admire, with an intensity that few of us can understand, the beauty of a flower or a tree, the delicacy of its color or the grace of its form, but they take ardent interest and deep delight in all the processes of nature. In the flowing of sap, in the opening of buds, in the formation and falling of leaves. Naturally, this characteristic is utilized by the great ones in charge of evolution, and nature spirits are employed to assist in the blending of colors and the arrangement of variations. They pay much attention, too, to bird and insect life, to the hatching of the egg and to the opening of the chrysalis, and they watch with jocund eye the play of lambs and fawns, of leverets and squirrels. Another inestimable advantage that an etheric evolution possesses over one which touches the denser physical is that the necessity of eating is avoided. The body of the fairy absorbs such nourishment as it needs, without trouble and without stint, from the ether which of necessity always surrounds it. Or rather, it is not, strictly speaking, that nourishment is absorbed, but rather that a change of particles is constantly taking place. Those which have been drained of their vitality being cast out and others which are full of it being drawn in to replace them. Though they do not eat, nature spirits obtain from the fragrance of flowers a pleasure analogous to that which men derive from the taste of food. The aroma is more to them than a mere question of smell or taste, for they bathe themselves in it so that it interpenetrates their bodies and reaches every particle simultaneously. What takes for them the place of a nervous system is far more delicate than ours, and sensitive to many vibrations which pass all unperceived by our grosser senses. And so they find what corresponds to a scent in many plants and minerals that have no scent for us. Their bodies have no more internal structure than a wreath of mist, so that they cannot be torn asunder or injured, and neither heat nor cold has any painful effect upon them. Indeed, there is one type whose members seem to enjoy above all things to bathe themselves in fire. They rush from all sides to any great conflagration and fly upward with the flames again and again in wild delight, just as a boy flies again and again down a toboggan slide. These are the spirits of the fire, the salamanders of medieval literature. Bodily pain can come to the nature spirit only from an unpleasant or inharmonious emanation or vibration, but his power of rapid locomotion enables him easily to avoid these. So far as can be observed, he is entirely free from the curse of fear, which plays so serious a part in the animal life which, along our line of evolution, corresponds to the level of the fairies. The romances of fairyland. The fairy has an enviably fertile imagination, and it is a great part of his daily play with his fellows to construct for them by its means all kinds of impossible surroundings and romantic situations. He is like a child telling stories to his playmates, but with this advantage over the child that, since the playmates can see both etheric and lower astral matter, the forms built by his vivid thought are plainly visible to them as his tale proceeds. No doubt many of his narrations would to us seem childish and oddly limited in scope, because such intelligence as the elf possesses works in directions so different from our own. But to him they are intensely real and a source of never-ending delight. The fairy who develops unusual talent in fiction wins great affection and honor from the rest, and gathers round him a permanent audience or following. When some human being chances to catch a glimpse of such a group, he usually imports into his account of it preconceptions derived from his own conditions, and takes the leader for a fairy king or queen, according to the form which that leader may for the moment happen to prefer. In reality, the realm of nature spirits needs no kind of government except the general supervision which is exercised over it, probably unconsciously to all but its higher members, by the Devarajas and their subordinates. Their attitude towards man. Most nature spirits dislike and avoid mankind, and we cannot wonder at it. To them man appears a ravaging demon, destroying and spoiling wherever he goes. He wantonly kills, often with awful tortures, all the beautiful creatures that they love to watch. He cuts down the trees, he tramples the grass, he plucks the flowers and casts them carelessly aside to die. He replaces all the lovely wild life of nature with his hideous bricks and mortar, and the fragrance of the flowers with the mephitic vapors of his chemicals and the all-polluting smoke of his factories. Can we think it strange that the fairies should regard us with horror, and shrink away from us as we shrink from a poisonous reptile? Not only do we thus bring devastation to all that they hold most dear, but most of our habits and emanations are distasteful to them. We poison the sweet air for them, some of us, with loathsome fumes of alcohol and tobacco. Our restless, ill-regulated desires and passions set up a constant rush of astral currents which disturbs and annoys them, and gives them the same feeling of disgust which we should have if a bucket of filthy water were emptied over us. For them to be near the average man is to live in a perpetual hurricane, a hurricane that has blown over a cesspool. They are not great angels, with the perfect knowledge that brings perfect patience. They are just happy and on the whole well-disposed children, hardly even that, many of them, but more like exceptionally intelligent kittens. Again, I say, can we wonder, when we thus habitually outrage their best and highest feelings, that they should dislike us, distrust us and avoid us? There are instances on record where, by some more than ordinarily unwarranted intrusion or annoyance on the part of man, they have been provoked into direct retaliation and have shown distinct malice. It speaks well for their kingdom as a whole that even under such unendurable provocation such cases are rare, and their more usual method of trying to repel an intruder is by playing tricks upon him, childish and mischievous often, but not seriously harmful. They take an impish delight in misleading or deceiving him, in causing him to lose his way across a moor, in keeping him walking round and round in a circle all night when he believes he is going straight on, or in making him think that he sees palaces and castles where no such structures really exist. Many a story illustrative of this curious characteristic of the fairies may be found among the village gossip of the peasantry in almost any lonely mountainous district. Glamour. They are greatly assisted in their tricks by the wonderful power which they possess of casting a glamour over those who yield themselves to their influence. So that such victims for the time see and hear only what these fairies impress upon them, exactly as the mesmerized subject sees, hears, feels and believes whatever the magnetiseur wishes. The nature spirits, however, have not the mesmerist's power of dominating the human will, except in the case of quite unusually weak-minded people, or of those who allow themselves to fall into such a condition of helpless terror that their will is temporarily in abeyance. The fairies cannot go beyond deception of the senses, but of that they are undoubted masters, and cases are not wanting in which they cast their glamour over a considerable number of people at once. It is by invoking their aid in the exercise of this peculiar power that some of the most marvelous feats of the Indian jugglers are performed, such as the celebrated basket trick, or that other in which a rope is thrown up towards the sky and remains rigid without support while the juggler climbs up it and disappears. The entire audience is in fact hallucinated, and the people are made to imagine that they see and hear a whole series of events which have not really occurred at all. The power of glamour is simply that of making a clear, strong mental image, and then projecting that into the mind of another. To most men this would seem well nigh impossible, because they have never made any such attempt in their lives, and have no notion how to set about it. The mind of the fairy has not the width or the range of the man's, but it is thoroughly well accustomed to this work of making images and impressing them on others, since it is one of the principal occupations of the creature's daily life. It is not remarkable that with such constant practice he should become expert at the business, and it is still further simplified for him when, as in the case of the Indian tricks, exactly the same image has to be produced over and over again hundreds of times, until every detail shapes itself without effort as the result of unconscious habit. In trying to understand exactly how this is done, we must bear in mind that a mental image is a very real thing, a definite construction in mental matter, as has been explained in Thought Forms, page 37. And we must also remember that the line of communication between the mind and the dense physical brain passes through the astral and etheric counterparts of that brain, and that the line may be tapped and an impression introduced at any of these points. Certain of the nature spirits not infrequently exercise their talent for mimicry and mischief by appearing at spiritualistic séances held for physical phenomena. Anyone who has been in the habit of attending on such occasions will recollect instances of practical joking and silly though usually good-natured horseplay. These almost always indicate the presence of some of these impish creatures, though they are sometimes due to the arrival of dead men who were senseless enough during earth life to consider such inanities amusing, and have not learned wisdom since their death. Instances of friendship. On the other hand, there are instances in which some nature spirits have made friends with individual human beings and offered them such assistance as lay in their power. As in the well-known stories told of Scotch brownies or of the fire-lighting fairies of spiritualistic literature. And it is on record that on rare occasions certain favored men have been admitted to witness elfin revels and share for a time the elfin life. It is said that wild animals will approach with confidence some Indian yogis, recognizing them as friends to all living creatures. Similarly, elves will gather round one who has entered upon the path of holiness, finding his emanations less stormy and more agreeable than those of the man whose mind is still fixed upon worldly matters. Occasionally fairies have been known to attach themselves to little children, and develop a strong attachment for them, especially for such as are dreamy and imaginative. Since they are able to see and delight in the thought forms with which such a child surrounds himself. There have even been cases in which such creatures took a fancy to some unusually attractive baby, and made an attempt to carry it away into their own haunts, their intention being to save it from what seems to them the horrible fate of growing up into the average human being. Vague traditions of such attempts account for part of the folklore stories about changelings, though there is also another reason for them to which we shall refer later. There have been times, more often in the past than in the present, when a certain class of these entities, roughly corresponding to humanity in size and appearance, made it a practice frequently to materialize. To make for themselves temporary but definite physical bodies, and by that means to enter into undesirable relations with such men and women as chose to put themselves in their way. From this fact, perhaps, come some of the stories of fauns and satyrs in the classical period, though those sometimes also refer to quite a different subhuman evolution. Water spirits. Abundant as are the fairies of the earth's surface almost anywhere away from the haunts of man, they are far outnumbered by the water spirits, the fairies of the surface of the sea. There is just as much variety here as on land. The nature spirits of the Pacific differ from those of the Atlantic, and those of the Mediterranean are quite distinct from either. The types that revel in the indescribably glorious blue of tropical oceans are far apart from those that dash through the foam of our cold grey northern seas. Dissimilar again are the spirits of the lake, the river and the waterfall, for they have many more points in common with the land fairies than have the nereids of the open sea. These, like their brothers of the land, are of all shapes, but perhaps most frequently imitate the human. Broadly speaking, they tend to take larger forms than the elves of the woods and the hills. The majority of the latter are diminutive, while the sea spirit who copies man usually adopts his size as well as his shape. In order to avoid misunderstanding, it is necessary constantly to insist upon the protean character of all these forms. Any of these creatures, whether of land or sea or air, can make himself temporarily larger or smaller at will, or can assume whatever shape he chooses. There is theoretically no restriction upon this power, but in practice it has its limits, though they are wide. A fairy who is naturally 12 inches in height can expand himself to the proportions of a man of 6 feet, but the effort would be a considerable strain, and could not be maintained for more than a few minutes. In order to take a form other than his own he must be able to conceive it clearly, and he can hold the shape only while his mind is fixed upon it. As soon as his thought wanders he will at once begin to resume his natural appearance. Though etheric matter can readily be molded by the power of thought, it naturally does not obey it as instantaneously as does astral matter. We might say that mental matter changes actually with the thought, and astral matter so quickly after it that the ordinary observer can scarcely note any difference. But with etheric matter 1 foot's vision can follow the growth or diminution without difficulty. A sylph, whose body is of astral matter, flashes from one shape into another. A fairy, who is etheric, swells or decreases quickly but not instantaneously. Few of the land spirits are gigantic in size, while such stature seems quite common out at sea. The creatures of the land frequently weave from their fancies scraps of human clothing, and show themselves with quaint caps or baldricks or jerkins. But I have never seen any such appearance among the inhabitants of the sea. Nearly all these surface water spirits seem to possess the power of raising themselves out of their proper element and floating in or flying through the air for a short distance. They delight in playing amidst the dashing foam or riding in upon the breakers. They are less pronounced in their avoidance of man than their brethren on land, perhaps because man has so much less opportunity of interfering with them. They do not descend to any great depth below the surface, never, at any rate, beyond the reach of light, so that there is always a considerable space between their realm and the domain of the far less evolved creatures of the middle deeps. Freshwater fairies. Some very beautiful species inhabit inland waters where man has not yet rendered the conditions impossible for them. Naturally enough, the filth and the chemicals with which water is polluted near any large town are disgusting to them. But they have apparently no objection to the water wheel in a quiet country nook, for they may sometimes be seen disporting themselves in a mill race. They seem specially to delight in falling water, just as their brothers of the sea revel in the breaking of foam. For the pleasure which it gives them they will sometimes even dare a nearer approach than usual to the hated presence of man. At Niagara, for example, there are almost always some still to be seen in the summer, though they generally keep well out towards the center of the falls and the rapids. Like birds of passage, in winter they abandon those northern waters, which are frozen over for many months, and seek a temporary home in more genial climes. A short frost they do not seem to mind. The mere cold has apparently little or no effect upon them, but they dislike the disturbance of their ordinary conditions. Some of those who commonly inhabit rivers transfer themselves to the sea when their streams freeze. To others salt water seems distasteful, and they prefer to migrate considerable distances rather than take refuge in the ocean. An interesting variety of the fairies of the water are the cloud spirits, entities whose life is spent almost entirely among those waters which be above the firmament. They should perhaps be classified as intermediate between the spirits of the water and those of the air. Their bodies are of etheric matter, as are the former, but they are capable of remaining away from the water for comparatively long periods. Their forms are often huge and loosely knit, they seem near of kin to some of the freshwater types, yet they are quite willing to dip for a time into the sea when the clouds which are their favorite habitat disappear. They dwell in the luminous silence of cloudland, and their favorite pastime is to mold their clouds into strange, fantastic shapes or to arrange them in the serried ranks which we call a mackerel sky. SWLPHS. We come now to the consideration of the highest type in the kingdom of the nature spirits, the stage at which the lines of development both of the land and sea creatures converge, the sylphs, or spirits of the air. These entities are definitely raised above all the other varieties of which we have been speaking by the fact that they have shaken themselves free from the encumbrance of physical matter, the astral body being now their lowest vehicle. Their intelligence is much higher than that of the etheric species, and quite equal to that of the average man, but they have not yet attained a permanent reincarnating individuality. Just because they are so much more evolved, before breaking away from the group soul they can understand much more about life than an animal can, and so it often happens that they know that they lack individuality and are intensely eager to gain it. That is the truth that lies at the back of all the widely spread traditions of the yearning of the nature spirit to obtain an immortal soul. The normal method for them to attain this is by association with and love for members of the next stage above them, the astral angels. A domestic animal, such as the dog or the cat, advances through the development of his intelligence and his affection, which is the result of his close relationship with his master. Not only does his love for that master cause him to make determined efforts to understand him, but the vibrations of the master's mind-body, constantly playing upon his rudimentary mind, gradually awaken it into greater and greater activity. And in the same way his affection for him arouses an ever-deepening feeling in return. The man may or may not definitely set himself to teach the animal something. In any case, even without any direct effort, the intimate connection between them helps the evolvement of the lower. Eventually the development of such an animal rises to the level which will allow him to receive the third outpouring, and thus he becomes an individual, and breaks away from his group soul. Now all this is also exactly what happens between the astral angel and the air spirit, except that by them the scheme is usually carried out in a much more intelligent and effective manner. Not one man in 1,000 thinks or knows anything about the real evolution of his dog or cat, still less does the animal comprehend the possibility that lies before him. But the angel clearly understands the plan of nature, and in many cases the nature spirit also knows what he needs, and works intelligently towards its attainment. So each of these astral angels usually has several sylphs attached to him, frequently definitely learning from him and being trained by him, but at any rate basking in the play of his intellect and returning his affection. Very many of these angels are employed as agents by the Devarajas in their duty of the distributing of karma. And thus it comes that the air spirits are often sub-agents in that work, and no doubt acquire much valuable knowledge while executing the tasks assigned to them. The adept knows how to make use of the services of the nature spirits when he requires them, and there are many pieces of business which he is able to entrust to them. In the issue of Broad Views for February, 1907, there appeared an admirable account of the ingenious manner in which a nature spirit executed a commission given to him in this way. He was instructed to amuse an invalid who was suffering from an attack of influenza, and for 5 days he kept up an almost continuous entertainment of strange and interesting visions, his efforts being crowned with the most gratifying success. For the sufferer wrote that his ministrations had the happy effect of turning what under ordinary circumstances would have been days of unutterable weariness and discomfort into a most wonderfully interesting experience. He showed a bewildering variety of pictures, moving masses of rock, seen not from the outside but from the inside, so that faces of creatures of various sorts appeared in them. He also exhibited mountains, forests and avenues, and sometimes great masses of architecture, portions of Corinthian columns, bits of statuary, and great arched roofs, often also the most wonderful flowers and palms, waving to and fro as if in a gentle breeze. Sometimes he seems to have taken the physical objects in the bedroom and woven them into a kind of magic transformation scene. One might indeed surmise, from the curious nature of the entertainment offered, the particular type to which belonged the nature spirit who was employed in this charitable work. The Oriental magician occasionally endeavors to obtain the assistance of the higher nature spirits in his performances, but the enterprise is not without its dangers. He must adopt either invocation or evocation, that is, he must either attract their attention as a suppliant and make some kind of bargain with them, or he must try to set in motion influences which will compel their obedience, an attempt which, if it fails, will arouse a determined hostility that is exceedingly likely to result in his premature extinction, or at the least will put him in an extremely ridiculous and unpleasant position. Of these air spirits, as of the lower fairies, there are many varieties, differing in power, in intelligence, and in habits as well as in appearance. They are naturally less restricted to locality than the other kinds which we have described, though like the others they seem to recognize the limits of certain zones of elevation, some kinds always floating near the surface of the earth, while others scarcely ever approach it. As a general rule they share the common dislike to the neighborhood of man and his restless desires, but there are occasions when they are willing to endure this for the sake of amusement or flattery. Their amusement. They extract immense entertainment sometimes out of the sport of ensouling thought forms of various kinds. An author in writing a novel, for example, naturally makes strong thought forms of all his characters, and moves them about his miniature stage like marionettes. But sometimes a party of jocund nature spirits will seize upon his forms, and play out the drama upon a scheme improvised on the spur of the moment, so that the dismayed novelist feels that his puppets have somehow got out of hand and developed a will of their own. The love of mischief which is so marked a characteristic of some of the fairies persists to a certain extent among at least the lower types of the air spirits, so that their impersonations are occasionally of a less innocent order. People whose evil karma has brought them under the domination of Calvinistic theology, but who have not yet the intelligence or the faith to cast aside its blasphemous doctrines, sometimes in their fear make awful thought forms of the imaginary devil to which their superstition gives such a prominent role in the universe. And I regret to say that certain impish nature spirits are quite unable to resist the temptation of masquerading in these terrible forms, and think it a great joke to flourish horns, to lash a forked tail, and to breathe out flames as they rush about. To anyone who understands the nature of these pantomime demons no harm is done. But now and then nervous children happen to be impressionable enough to catch a glimpse of such things, and if they have not been wisely taught, great terror is the result. It is only fair to the nature spirit to remember that, as he himself is incapable of fear, he does not in the least understand the gravity of this result, and probably considers the child's fright as simulated, and as part of the game. We can hardly blame the nature spirit for the fact that we permit our children to be bound by the chains of a groveling superstition. and neglect to impress upon them the grand fundamental fact that God is love and that perfect love casteth out all fear. If our air spirit occasionally thus terrifies the ill-instructed living child, it must on the other hand be set to his credit that he constantly affords the keenest pleasure to thousands of children who are what we call dead. For to play with them and to entertain them in 100 different ways is one of his happiest occupations. The air spirits have discovered the opportunity afforded to them by the spiritualistic séance, and some of them become habitual attendants, usually under some such name as Daisy or Sunflower. They are quite capable of giving a very interesting séance, for they naturally know a good deal about astral life and its possibilities. They will readily answer questions, truly enough as far as their knowledge goes, and with, at any rate, an appearance of profundity when the subject is somewhat beyond them. They can produce raps, tilts and lights without difficulty, and are quite prepared to deliver whatever messages they may see to be desired, not in the least meaning in this way harm or deceit, but naively rejoicing in their success in playing the part, and in the wealth of awe-stricken devotion and affection lavished upon them as dear spirits and angel helpers. They learn to share the delight of the sitters, and feel themselves to be doing a good work in thus bringing comfort to the afflicted. Living astrally as they do, the fourth dimension is a commonplace fact of their existence, and this makes quite simple for them many little tricks which to us appear wonderful, such as the removal of articles from a locked box or the apport of flowers into a closed room. The desires and emotions of the sitters lie open before them, they quickly acquire facility in reading any but abstract thoughts, and the management of a materialization is quite within their power when adequate material is provided. It will therefore be seen that without any exterior assistance they are competent to provide a varied and satisfactory evening's entertainment, and there is no doubt that they have often done so. I am not for a moment suggesting that nature spirits are the only entities which operate at séances. The manifesting spirit is often exactly what he claims to be, but it is also true that he is often nothing of the kind, and the average sitter has absolutely no means of distinguishing between the genuine article and the imitation. An abnormal development. As has already been said, the normal line of advancement for the nature spirit is to attain individuality by association with an angel, but there have been individuals who have departed from that rule. The intensity of affection felt by the sylph for the angel is the principal factor in the great change, and the abnormal cases are those in which that affection has been fixed upon a human being instead. This involves so complete a reversal of the common attitude of these beings towards humanity that its occurrence is naturally rare. But when it happens, and when the love is strong enough to lead to individualization, it detaches the nature spirit from his own line of evolution and brings him over into ours, so that the newly developed ego will incarnate not as an angel but as a man. Some tradition of this possibility lies at the back of all the stories in which a non-human spirit falls in love with a man, and yearns with a great longing to obtain an immortal soul in order to be able to spend eternity with him. Upon attaining his incarnation, such a spirit usually makes a man of very curious type, affectionate and emotional but wayward, strangely primitive in certain ways, and utterly without any sense of responsibility. It has sometimes happened that a sylph who was thus strongly attracted to a man or a woman, but just fell short of the intensity of affection necessary to ensure individualization, has made an effort to obtain a forcible entrance into human evolution by taking possession of the body of a dying baby just as its original owner left it. The child would seem to recover, to be snatched back from the very jaws of death, but would be likely to appear much changed in disposition, and probably peevish and irritable in consequence of the unaccustomed constraint of a dense physical body. If the sylph were able to adapt himself to the body, there would be nothing to prevent him from retaining it through a life of the ordinary length. If during that life he succeeded in developing affection sufficiently ardent to sever his connection with his group soul, he would thereafter reincarnate as a human being in the usual way. If not, he would fall back at its conclusion into his own line of evolution. It will be seen that in these facts we have the truth which underlies the widely disseminated tradition of changelings, which is found in all the countries of northwestern Europe, in China, and also, it is said, among the natives of the Pacific slope of North America. The advantage of studying them. The kingdom of the nature spirits is a most interesting field of study, to which but little attention has been paid. Though they are often mentioned in occult literature, I am not aware that any attempt has yet been made to classify them in scientific fashion. This vast realm of nature still needs its Cuvier or its Linnaeus. But perhaps when we have plenty of trained investigators we may hope that one of them will take upon himself this role, and furnish us as his life's work with a complete and detailed natural history of these delightful creatures. It will be no waste of labor, no unworthy study. It is useful for us to understand these beings, not solely nor even chiefly because of the influence they exert upon us, but because the comprehension of a line of evolution so different from our own broadens our minds and helps us to recognize that the world does not exist for us alone, and that our point of view is neither the only one nor the most important. Foreign travel has the same effect in a minor degree, for it demonstrates to every unprejudiced man that races in every respect as good as his own may yet differ widely from it in 100 ways. In the study of the nature spirits we find the same idea carried much further. Here is a kingdom radically dissimilar, without sex, free from fear, ignorant of what is meant by the struggle for existence, yet the eventual result of its unfoldment is in every respect equal to that attained by following our own line. To learn this may help us to see a little more of the many-sidedness of the solar deity, and so may teach us modesty and charity as well as liberality of thought. Chapter 7. By Centers of Magnetism. We all recognize to some extent that unusual surroundings may produce special effects. We speak of certain buildings or landscapes as gloomy and depressing. We understand that there is something saddening and repellent about a prison, something devotional about a church, and so on. Most people never trouble to think why this should be so, or if they do for a moment turn their attention to the matter, they dismiss it as an instance of the association of ideas. Probably it is that, but it is also much more than that, and if we examine into its rationale we shall find that it operates in many cases where we have never suspected its influence. And that a knowledge of it may be of practical use in everyday life. A study of the finer forces of nature will show us not only that every living being is radiating a complex set of definite influences upon those about him, but also that this is true to a lesser degree and in a simpler manner of inanimate objects. Our great cathedrals. We know that wood and iron and stone have their own respective characteristic radiations, but the point to be emphasized just now is that they are all capable of absorbing human influence, and then pouring it out again. What is the origin of that feeling of devotion, of reverential awe, which so permeates some of our great cathedrals that even the most hardened Cook's tourist cannot entirely escape it? It is due not only to the historical associations, not only to the remembrance of the fact that for centuries men have met here for praise and prayer, but far more to that fact itself, and to the conditions which it has produced in the substance of the fabric. To understand this we must first of all remember the circumstances under which those buildings were erected. A modern brick church, run up by contract in the shortest possible time, has indeed but little sanctity about it. But in medieval days faith was greater, and the influence of the outer world less prominent. In very truth men prayed as they built our great cathedrals, and laid every stone as though it had been an offering upon an altar. When this was the spirit of the work, every such stone became a veritable talisman charged with the reverence and devotion of the builder, and capable of radiating those same waves of sensation upon others, so as to stir in them similar feelings. The crowds who came afterwards to worship at the shrine not only felt these radiations, but themselves strengthened them in turn by the reaction of their own feelings. Still more is this true of the interior decorations of the church. Every touch of the brush in the coloring of a triptych, every stroke of the chisel in the sculpture of a statue, was a direct offering to God. Thus the completed work of art is surrounded by an atmosphere of reverence and love, and it distinctly sheds these qualities upon the worshippers. All of them, rich and poor alike, feel something of this effect, even though many of them may be too ignorant to receive the added stimulus which its artistic excellence gives to those who are able to appreciate it and to perceive all that it means. The sunlight streaming through the splendid stained glass of those medieval windows brings with it a glory that is not all of the physical world. For the clever workman who built up that marvelous mosaic did so for the love of God and the glory of his saints, and so each fragment of glass is a talisman also. Remembering always how the power conveyed into the statue or picture by the fervor of the original artist has been perpetually reinforced through the ages by the devotion of successive generations of worshippers. We come to understand the inner meaning of the great influence which undoubtedly does radiate from such objects as have been regarded as sacred for centuries. Such a devotional effect as is described in connection with a picture or a statue may be entirely apart from its value as a work of art. The Bambino at the Era Coeli at Rome is a supremely inartistic object, yet it has unquestionably considerable power in evoking devotional feeling among the masses that crowd to see it. If it were really a work of art, that fact would add but little to its influence over most of them. Though of course it would in that case produce an additional and totally different effect upon another class of persons to whom now it does not in the least appeal. From these considerations it is evident that these various ecclesiastical properties, such as statues, pictures and other decorations, have a real value in the effect which they produce upon the worshippers. And the fact that they thus have a distinct power, which so many people can feel, probably accounts for the intense hatred felt for them by the savage fanatics who miscalled themselves Puritans. They realized that the power which stood behind the Church worked to a great extent through these objects as its channels, and though their loathing for all higher influences was considerably tempered by fear, they yet felt that if they could break up these centers of magnetism, that would to a certain extent cut off the connection. And so in their revolt against all that was good and beautiful they did all the harm that they could, almost as much perhaps as those earlier so-called Christians who, through sheer ignorance, ground up the most lovely Grecian statues to furnish lime to build their wretched hovels. In all these splendid medieval buildings the sentiment of devotion absolutely and literally exudes from the walls, because for centuries devotional thought forms have been created in them by successive generations. In strong contrast to this is the atmosphere of criticism and disputation which may be felt by any sensitive person in the meeting houses of some of the sects. In many a conventicle in Scotland and in Holland this feeling stands out with startling prominence, so as to give the impression that the great majority of the so-called worshippers have had no thought of worship or devotion at all, but only of the most sanctimonious self-righteousness, and of burning anxiety to discover some doctrinal flaw in the wearisome sermon of their unfortunate minister. An absolutely new church does not at first produce any of these effects, for in these days workmen build a church with the same lack of enthusiasm as a factory. As soon as the bishop consecrates it, a decided influence is set up as the effect of that ceremony, but the consideration of that belongs to another chapter of our work. A few years of use will charge the walls very effectively, and a much shorter period than that will produce the result in a church where the sacrament is reserved, or where perpetual adoration is offered. The Roman Catholic or ritualistic church soon becomes thoroughly affected, but the meeting houses of some of the dissenting sects which do not make a special point of devotion often produce for a long time an influence scarcely distinguishable from that which is to be felt in an ordinary lecture hall. A fine type of devotional influence is often to be found in the chapel of a convent or monastery, though again the type differs greatly according to the objects which the monks or the nuns set before themselves. Temples. I have been taking Christian fanes as an example, because they are those which are most familiar to me, which will also be most familiar to the majority of my readers. Also perhaps because Christianity is the religion which has made a special point of devotion, and has, more than any other, arranged for the simultaneous expression of it in special buildings erected for that purpose. Among Hindus the Vaishnavite has a devotion quite as profound as that of any Christian, though unfortunately it is often tainted by expectation of favors to be given in return. But the Hindu has no idea of anything like combined worship. Though on great festivals enormous crowds attend the temples, each person makes his little prayer or goes through his little ceremony for himself, and so he misses the enormous additional effect which is produced by simultaneous action. Regarded solely from the point of view of charging the walls of the temple with devotional influence, this plan differs from the other in a way that we may perhaps understand by taking a physical illustration of a number of sailors pulling at a rope. We know that, when that is being done, a sort of chant is generally used in order to ensure that the men shall apply their strength at exactly the same moment. And in that way a much more effective pull is produced than would be achieved if each man put out exactly the same strength, but applied it just when he felt that he could, and without any relation to the work of the others. Nevertheless, as the years roll by, there comes to be a strong feeling in a Vaishnavite temple, as strong perhaps as that of the Christians, though quite different in kind. Different again in quite another way is the impression produced in the great temples dedicated to Shiva. In such a shrine as that at Madura, for example, an exceedingly powerful influence radiates from the Holy of Holies. It is surrounded by a strong feeling of reverential awe, almost of fear, and this so deeply tinges the devotion of the crowds who come to worship that the very aura of the place is changed by it. Completely different again is the impression which surrounds a Buddhist temple. Of fear we have there absolutely no trace whatever. We have perhaps less of direct devotion, for to a large extent devotion is replaced by gratitude. The prominent radiation is always one of joyfulness and love, an utter absence of anything dark or stern. Another complete contrast is represented by the Mohammedan mosque. Devotion of a sort is present there also, but it is distinctly a militant devotion, and the particular impression that it gives one is that of a fiery determination. One feels that this population's comprehension of their creed may be limited, but there is no question whatever as to their dogged determination to hold by it. The Jewish synagogue again is like none of the others, but has a feeling which is quite distinct, and curiously dual, exceptionally materialistic on one side, and on the other full of a strong, pathetic longing for the return of vanished glories. Sites and relics. A partial recognition of another facet of the facts which we have been mentioning accounts for the choice of the site of many religious edifices. A church or a temple is frequently erected to commemorate the life and death of some saint, and in the first instance such a fane is built upon a spot which has some special connection with him. It may be the place where he died, the spot where he was born, or where some important event of his life occurred. The Church of the Nativity at Bethlehem and that of the Crucifixion at Jerusalem are instances of this, as is also the great stupa at Buddha Gaya where the Lord Gautama attained his Buddhahood. Or the temple of the Bishanpad, where it is supposed that Vishnu left his footmark. All such shrines are erected not so much from an historical sense which wishes to indicate for the benefit of posterity the exact spot where an important event happened, as with the idea that that spot is especially blessed. Especially charged with a magnetism which will remain through the ages, and will radiate upon and benefit those who bring themselves within the radius of its influence. Nor is this universal idea without adequate foundation. The spot at which the Lord Buddha gained the step which gives him that august title is charged with a magnetism which causes it to glow forth like a sun for anyone who has clairvoyant vision. It is calculated to produce the strongest possible magnetic effect on anyone who is naturally sensitive to such influence. Or who deliberately makes himself temporarily sensitive to such influence by putting himself in an attitude of heartfelt devotion. In a recent article on Buddha Gaya in the Lotus Journal El-Sayani wrote, "When I sat quietly under the tree for a while with Mrs. Besant, I was able to see the Lord Buddha, as he had looked when he sat there. Indeed, the record of his meditation is still so strong that it needs only a little clairvoyance to see him even now. I had the advantage of having met him in that life in 588 BC. And become one of his followers, so that it was easier for me to see him again in this present life. But I think almost anyone who is a little sensitive would see him at Buddha Gaya by staying quite quiet for a little time because the air is full of his influence, and even now there are always great devas bathing in the magnetism and guarding the place. Other churches, temples or dagobas are sanctified by the possession of relics of some great one, and here again the connection of ideas is obvious. It is customary for those who are ignorant of these matters to ridicule the idea of paying reverence to the fragment of bone which once belonged to a saint. But though reverence paid to the bone may be out of place, the influence radiating from that bone may nevertheless be quite a real thing, and well worthy of serious attention. That the trade in relics has led, all the world over, to fraud on the one hand and blind credulity on the other, is not a thing to be disputed, but that by no means alters the fact that a genuine relic may be a valuable thing. Whatever has been part of the physical body of a great one, or even of the garments which have clothed that physical body, is impregnated with his personal magnetism. That means that it is charged with the powerful waves of thought and feeling which used to issue from him, just as an electrical battery may be charged. Such force as it possesses is intensified and perpetuated by the thought waves poured upon it as the years roll by the faith and devotion of the crowds who visit the shrine. This when the relic is genuine, but most relics are not genuine. Even then, though they have no initial strength of their own, they acquire much influence as time goes on, so that even a false relic is by no means without effect. Therefore anyone putting himself into a receptive attitude, and coming into the immediate neighborhood of a relic, will receive into himself its strong vibrations, and soon will be more or less attuned to them. Since those vibrations are unquestionably better and stronger than any which he is likely to generate on his own account, this is a good thing for him. For the time being it lifts him on to a higher level, it opens a higher world to him. And though the effect is only temporary, this cannot but be good for him, an event which will leave him, for the rest of his life, slightly better than if it had not occurred. This is the rationale of pilgrimages, and they are quite often really effective. In addition to whatever may have been the original magnetism contributed by the holy man or relic, as soon as the place of pilgrimage is established and numbers of people begin to visit it, another factor comes into play, of which we have already spoken in the case of churches and temples. The place begins to be charged with the devotional feeling of all these hosts of visitors, and what they leave behind reacts upon their successors. Thus the influence of one of these holy places usually does not decrease as time passes, for if the original force tends slightly to diminish, on the other hand it is constantly fed by new accessions of devotion. Indeed, the only case in which the power ever fades is that of a neglected shrine as, for example, when a country is conquered by people of another religion, to whom the older shrines are as nothing. Even then the influence, if it has been originally sufficiently strong, persists almost without diminution for many centuries, and for this reason even ruins have often a powerful force connected with them. The Egyptian religion, for example, has been practiced little since the Christian era, yet no sensitive person can stand amidst the ruins of one of its temples without being powerfully affected by the stream of its thought. In this particular instance another force comes into play. The Egyptian architecture was of a definite type, intentionally so erected for the purpose of producing a definite impression upon its worshippers, and perhaps no architecture has ever fulfilled its purpose more effectively. The shattered fragments which remain still produce that effect to no inconsiderable degree, even upon members of an alien race altogether out of touch with the type of the old Egyptian civilization. For the student of comparative religion who happens to be sensitive, there can be no more interesting experience than this, to bathe in the magnetism of the older religions of the world. To feel their influence as their devotees felt it thousands of years ago, to compare the sensations of Thebes or Luxor with those of the Parthenon or of the beautiful Greek temples of Girgenti, or those of Stonehenge with the vast ruins of Yucatan. Ruins. The religious life of the Old World can best be sensed in this way through the agency of its temples. But it is equally possible in the same way to come into touch with the daily life of those vanished nations, by standing among the ruins of their palaces and their homes. This needs perhaps a keener clairvoyant sense than the other. The force which permeates the temple is powerful because it is to a considerable extent one-pointed, because all through the centuries people have come to it with one leading idea of prayer or devotion. And so the impression made has been comparatively powerful. In their homes, on the other hand, they have lived out their lives with all kinds of different ideas and warring interests, so that the impressions often cancel one another. Nevertheless there emerges, as years roll on, a sort of least common multiple of all their feelings, which is characteristic of them as a race. And this can be sensed by one who has the art of entirely suppressing those personal feelings of his own, which are so far nearer and more vivid to him, and listening earnestly to catch the faint echo of the life of those times so long ago. Such study often enables one to take a juster view of history, manners and customs which startle and horrify us, because they are so remote from our own, can in this way be contemplated from the point of view of those to whom they were familiar. And in seeing them thus, one often realizes for the first time how entirely we have misconceived those men of the past. Some of us may remember how, in our childhood, ignorant though well-meaning relations endeavored to excite our sympathy by stories of Christian martyrs who were thrown to the lions in the Colosseum at Rome. Or reprobated with horror the callous brutality which could assemble thousands to enjoy the combats between gladiators. I am not prepared to defend the tastes and amusements of the ancient Roman citizen, yet I think that any sensitive person who will go to the Colosseum at Rome and, if he can for the moment escape from the tourist, sit down there quietly, and let his consciousness drift backwards in time until he can sense the real feeling of those enormous, wildly excited audiences, will find that he has done them a gross injustice. First, he will realize that the throwing of Christians to the lions because of their religious belief is a pious falsehood of the unprincipled early Christians. He will find that the government of Rome was in religious matters distinctly more tolerant than most European governments at the present day. That no person was ever executed or persecuted on account of any religious opinion whatever, and that those so-called Christians who were put to death suffered not in the least because of their alleged religion, but because of conspiracy against the state, or of crimes which we should all join in reprobating. He will find that the government allowed and even encouraged gladiatorial combats, but he will also find that only three classes of people took part in them. First, condemned criminals, men whose lives had been forfeited to the law of the time, were utilized to provide a spectacle for the people, a degrading spectacle certainly, but not in any way more so than many which receive popular approval at the present day. The malefactor was killed in the arena, fighting either against another malefactor or a wild beast. But he preferred to die fighting rather than at the hands of the law, and there was always just a possibility that if he fought well he might thereby contrive to earn the applause of the fickle population, and so save his life. The second class consisted of such prisoners of war as it was the fashion of the time to put to death. But in this case also these were people whose death was already decided upon, and this particular form of death utilized them for a certain form of popular entertainment, and also gave them a chance of saving their lives, at which they eagerly grasped. The third class were the professional gladiators, men like the prize fighters of the present day, men who took up this horrible line of life for the sake of the popularity which it brought, accepting it with their eyes fully open to its danger. I am not for a moment suggesting that the gladiatorial show was a form of entertainment which could possibly be tolerated by a really enlightened people. But if we are to apply the same standard now, we shall have to admit that no enlightened nations have yet come into existence, for it was no worse than the medieval tournaments, than the cockfighting and bear-baiting of a century ago, or than the bullfight or prize-fight of the present day. Nor is there anything to choose between the brutality of its supporters and that of the people who go in vast crowds to see how many rats a dog can kill in a minute, or that of the noble sportsmen who, without the excuse of anything in the nature of a fair fight, go out to slaughter hundreds of inoffensive partridges. We are beginning to set a somewhat higher value on human life than they did in the days of ancient Rome. But even so I would point out that change does not mark a difference between the ancient Roman race and its reincarnation in the English people, for our own race was equally callous about wholesale slaughter up to a century ago. The difference is not between us and the Romans, but between us and our very recent ancestors. For the crowds which in the days of our fathers went and jested at a public execution can hardly be said to have advanced much since the time when they crowded the benches of the Colosseum. It is true that the Roman emperors attended those exhibitions, as the English kings used to encourage the tournament, and as the kings of Spain even now patronize the bullfight. But in order to understand the varied motives which led them to do this we must make a thorough study of the politics of the time, a matter which is quite outside the scope of this book. Here it must suffice to say that the Roman citizens were a body of men in a very curious political position, and that the authorities considered it necessary to provide them with constant entertainments in order to keep them in a good humor. Therefore they hit upon this method of utilizing what they regarded as the necessary and customary execution of criminals and rebels, in order to provide for the proletariat a kind of entertainment which it enjoyed. A very brutal proletariat, you will say. One must certainly admit that they were not highly advanced, but at least they were far better than those much later specimens who took active part in the unspeakable horrors of the French Revolution. For these last felt an active delight in blood and cruelty, which were only unnoticed concomitants of the enjoyment in the case of the Roman. Anyone who, standing in the Colosseum, as I have said, will really allow himself to feel the true spirit of those crowds of long ago, will understand that what appealed to them was the excitement of the contest and the skill exhibited in it. Their brutality consisted not in the fact that they enjoyed bloodshed and suffering, but that in the excitement of watching the struggle they were able to ignore it, which after all is very much what we do when we eagerly follow in the columns of our newspapers the news from the seat of war in the present day. Level for level, case for case, we of the fifth subrace have made a slight advance from the condition of the fourth subrace of 2,000 years ago, but that advance is much slighter than our self-satisfaction has persuaded us. Every country has its ruins, and in all alike the study of the older life is an interesting study. A good idea of the wonderfully varied activities and interests of the medieval monastic life in England may be obtained by visiting that queen of ruins, Fountains Abbey. Just as by visiting the stones of Karnak, not in Egypt but in Morbihan, one may watch the midsummer rejoicings round the Tantad or sacred fire of the ancient Bretons. There is perhaps less necessity to study the ruins of India, since daily life there has remained so unchanged throughout the ages that no clairvoyant faculty is required to picture it as it was thousands of years ago. None of the actual buildings of India go back to any period of appreciable difference, and in most cases the relics of the golden age of India under the great Atlantean monarchies are already deeply buried. If we turn to medieval times, the effect of environment and religion on practically the same people is curiously illustrated by the difference in feeling between any ancient city of the north of India and the ruins of Anuradhapura in Ceylon. Modern cities. Just as our ancestors of long ago lived their ordinary lives in what was to them the ordinary commonplace way, and never dreamed that in doing so they were impregnating the stones of their city walls with influences which would enable a psychometer thousands of years afterwards to study the inmost secrets of their existence. So we ourselves are impregnating our cities and leaving behind us a record which will shock the sensibilities of the more developed men of the future. In certain ways which will readily suggest themselves, all great towns are much alike. But on the other hand there are differences of local atmosphere, depending to some extent upon the average morality of the city, the type of religious views most largely held in it, and its principal trades and manufactures. For all these reasons each city has a certain amount of individuality, and individuality which will attract some people and repel others, according to their disposition. Even those who are not specially sensitive can hardly fail to note the distinction between the feeling of Paris and that of London, between Edinburgh and Glasgow, or between Philadelphia and Chicago. There are some cities whose keynote is not of the present but of the past, whose life in earlier days was so much more forcible than it is now, that the present is dwarfed by its comparison. The cities on the Zuider Zee in Holland are an instance of this, Albans in England is another. But the finest example which the world has to offer is the immortal city of Rome. Rome stands alone among the cities of the world in having three great and entirely separate interests for the psychic investigator. First, and much the strongest, is the impression left by the astonishing vitality and vigor of that Rome which was the center of the world, the Rome of the Republic and the Caesars. Then comes another strong and unique impression, that of medieval Rome, the ecclesiastical center of the world, third and quite different from either, the modern Rome of today. The political center of the somewhat loosely integrated Italian kingdom, and at the same time still an ecclesiastical center of widespread influence, though shorn of its glory and power. I first went to Rome, I confess, with the expectation that the Rome of the medieval popes, with the assistance of all the world thought that must for so long have been centered upon it, and with the advantage also of being so much nearer to us in time, would have to a considerable extent blotted out the life of the Rome of the Caesars. I was startled to find that the actual facts are almost exactly the reverse of that. The conditions of Rome in the Middle Ages were sufficiently remarkable to have stamped an indelible character upon any other town in the world. But so enormously stronger was the amazingly vivid life of that earlier civilization, that it still stands out, in spite of all the history that has been made there since, as the one ineffaceable and dominating characteristic of Rome. To the clairvoyant investigator, Rome is, and ever will be, first of all the Rome of the Caesars, and only secondarily the Rome of the popes. The impression of ecclesiastical history is all there, recoverable to the minutest detail. A bewildering mass of devotion and intrigue, of insolent tyranny and real religious feeling, a history of terrible corruption and of worldwide power, but rarely used as well as it might have been. And yet, mighty as it is dwarfed into absolute insignificance by the grander power that went before it. There was a robustness of faith in himself, a conviction of destiny, a resolute intention to live his life to the utmost, and a certainty of being able to do it, about the ancient Roman, which few nationalities of today can approach. Public buildings. Not only has a city as a whole its general characteristics, but such of the buildings in it as are devoted to special purposes have always an aura characteristic of that purpose. The aura of a hospital, for example, is a curious mixture. A preponderance of suffering, weariness and pain, but also a good deal of pity for the suffering, and a feeling of gratitude on the part of the patients for the kindly care which is taken of them. The neighborhood of a prison is decidedly to be avoided when a man is selecting a residence, for from it radiate the most terrible gloom and despair and settled depression, mingled with impotent rage, grief and hatred. Few places have on the whole a more unpleasant aura around them, and even in the general darkness there are often spots blacker than the rest, cells of unusual horror round which an evil reputation hangs. For example, there are several cases on record in which the successive occupants of a certain cell in a prison have all tried to commit suicide, those who were unsuccessful explaining that the idea of suicide persistently arose in their minds, and was steadily pressed upon them from without, until they were gradually brought into a condition in which there seemed to be no alternative. There have been instances in which such a feeling was due to the direct persuasion of a dead man. But also and more frequently it is simply that the first suicide has charged the cell so thoroughly with thoughts and suggestions of this nature that the later occupants, being probably persons of no great strength or development of will, have found themselves practically unable to resist. More terrible still are the thoughts which still hang round some of the dreadful dungeons of medieval tyrannies, the oubliettes of Venice or the torture dens of the Inquisition. Just in the same way the very walls of a gambling house radiate grief, envy, despair and hatred, and those of the public house, or house of ill fame, absolutely reek with the coarsest forms of sensual and brutal desire. Cemeteries. In such cases as those mentioned above, it is easy enough for all decent people to escape the pernicious influences simply by avoiding the place. But there are other instances in which people are placed in undesirable situations through the indulgence of natural good feeling. In countries which are not civilized enough to burn their dead, survivors constantly haunt the graves in which decaying physical bodies are laid. From a feeling of affectionate remembrance they gather often to pray and meditate there, and to lay wreaths of flowers upon the tombs. They do not understand that the radiations of sorrow, depression and helplessness which so frequently permeate the churchyard or cemetery make it an eminently undesirable place to visit. I have seen old people walking and sitting about in some of our more beautiful cemeteries, and nursemaids wheeling along young children in their perambulators to take their daily airing. Neither of them probably having the least idea that they are subjecting themselves and their charges to influences which will most likely neutralize all the good of the exercise and the fresh air. And this quite apart from the possibility of unhealthy physical exhalations. Universities and schools. The ancient buildings of our great universities are surrounded with magnetism of a special type, which does much toward setting upon its graduates that peculiar seal which is so readily distinguishable. Even though it is not easy to say in so many words exactly of what it consists. Men attending the university are of many and various types: reading men, hunting men, pious men, careless men, and sometimes one college of a university attracts only one of these classes. In that case its walls become permeated with those characteristics, and its atmosphere operates to keep up its reputation. But on the whole the university is surrounded with a pleasant feeling of work and comradeship, of association yet of independence, a feeling of respect for the traditions of the alma mater and the resolve to uphold them, which soon brings the new undergraduate into line with his fellows and imposes upon him the unmistakable university tone. Not unlike this is the influence exerted by the buildings of our great public schools. The impressionable boy who comes to one of these soon feels about him a sense of order and regularity and esprit de corps, which once gained can scarcely be forgotten. Something of the same sort, but perhaps even more pronounced, exists in the case of a battleship, especially if she is under a popular captain and has been some little time in commission. There also the new recruit very quickly finds his place, soon acquires the esprit de corps, soon learns to feel himself one of a family whose honor he is bound to uphold. Much of this is due to the example of his fellows and to the pressure of the officers, but the feeling, the atmosphere of the ship herself undoubtedly bears a share in it also. Libraries, museums and galleries. The studious associations of a library are readily comprehensible, but those of museums and picture galleries are much more varied, as might be expected. In both these latter cases the influence is principally from pictures or the objects shown, and consequently our discussion of it is part of a later chapter. As far as the influence of the actual buildings is concerned, apart from the objects exhibited in them, the result is a little unexpected, for a prominent feature is a quite overwhelming sense of fatigue and boredom. It is evident that the chief constituent in the minds of the majority of the visitors is the feeling that they know that they ought to admire or to be interested in this or that. Whereas as a matter of fact they are quite unable to achieve the least real admiration or interest. The stockyards of Chicago. The awful emanations from the stockyards in Chicago, and the effect they produce on those who are so unfortunate as to live anywhere near them, have often been mentioned in theosophical literature. Mrs. Besant herself has described how on her first visit she felt the terrible pall of depression which they cause while she was yet in the train many miles from Chicago. And though other people, less sensitive than she, might not be able to detect it so readily, there can be no doubt that its influence lies heavily upon them whenever they draw near to the theater of that awful iniquity. On that spot millions of creatures have been slaughtered and every one of them has added to its radiations its own feelings of rage and pain and fear and the sense of injustice. And out of it all has been formed one of the blackest clouds of horror at present existing in the world. In this case the results of the influence are commonly known, and it is impossible for anyone to profess incredulity. The low level of morality and the exceeding brutality of the slaughterman are matters of notoriety. In many of the murders committed in that dreadful neighborhood the doctors have been able to recognize a peculiar twist of the knife which is used only by slaughtermen, and the very children in the streets play no games but games of killing. When the world becomes really civilized men will look back with incredulous horror upon such scenes as these, and will ask how it could have been possible that people who in other respects seem to have had some gleams of humanity and common sense could permit so appalling a blot upon their honor as is the very existence of this accursed thing in their midst. Special places. Any spot where some ceremony has been frequently repeated, especially if in connection with it a high ideal has been set up, is always charged with a decided influence. For example, the hamlet of Oberammergau, where for many years at set intervals the Passion Play has been reproduced, is full of thought forms of the previous performances, which react powerfully upon those who are preparing themselves to take part in a modern representation. An extraordinary sense of reality and of the deepest earnestness is felt by all those who assist, and it reacts even upon the comparatively careless tourist, to whom the whole thing is simply an exhibition. In the same way the magnificent ideals of Wagner are prominent in the atmosphere of Bayreuth, and they make a performance there a totally different thing from one by identically the same players anywhere else. Sacred mountains. There are instances in which the influence attached to a special place is non-human. This is usually the case with the many sacred mountains of the world. I have described in a previous chapter the great angels who inhabit the summit of the mountain of Slievenamon in Ireland. It is their presence which makes the spot sacred, and they perpetuate the influence of the holier magic of the leaders of the Tuatha De Danann, which they ordain to remain until the day of the future greatness of Ireland shall come, and its part in the mighty drama of empire shall be made clear. I have several times visited a sacred mountain of a different type, Adam's Peak in Ceylon. The remarkable thing about this peak is that it is held as a sacred spot by people of all the various religions of the island. The Buddhists give to the temple on its summit the name of the shrine of the Shripta or holy footprint. And their story is that when the Lord Buddha visited Ceylon in his astral body, he was never there in the physical, he paid a visit to the tutelary genius of that mountain, who is called by the people Samandavayo. Just as he was about to depart, Samandavayo asked him as a favor to leave on that spot some permanent memory of his visit, and the Buddha in response is alleged to have pressed his foot upon the solid rock, utilizing some force which made upon it a definite imprint or indentation. The story goes on to say that Samandavayo, in order that this holy footprint should never be defiled by the touch of man, and that the magnetism radiating from it should be preserved, covered it with a huge cone of rock, which makes the present summit of the mountain. On the top of this cone a hollow has been made which roughly resembles a huge foot, and it seems probable that some of the more ignorant worshippers believe that to be the actual mark made by the Lord Buddha. But all the monks who know emphatically deny that, and point to the fact that this is not only enormously too large to be a human footprint, but that it is also quite obviously artificial. They explain that it is made there simply to indicate the exact spot under which the true footprint lies, and they point to the fact that there is unquestionably a crack running all round the rock at some distance below the summit. The idea of a sacred footprint on that summit seems to be common to the various religions, but while the Buddhists hold it to be that of the Lord Buddha, the Tamil inhabitants of the island suppose it to be one of the numerous footprints of Vishnu. And the Christians and the Mohammedans attribute it to Adam, whence the name Adam's peak. But it is said that long before any of these religions had penetrated to the island, long before the time of the Lord Buddha himself, this peak was already sacred to Samandavayo, to whom the deepest reverence is still paid by the inhabitants, as indeed it well may be, since he belongs to one of the great orders of the angels who rank near to the highest among the adepts. Although his work is of a nature entirely different from ours, he also obeys the head of the great occult hierarchy, he also is one of the great white brotherhood which exists only for the purpose of forwarding the evolution of the world. The presence of so great a being naturally sheds a powerful influence over the mountain and its neighborhood, and most of all over its summit. So that there is emphatically a reality behind to account for the joyous enthusiasm so freely manifested by the pilgrims. Here also, as at other shrines, we have in addition to this the effect of the feeling of devotion with which successive generations of pilgrims have impregnated the place, but though that cannot but be powerful, it is yet in this case completely overshadowed by the original and ever-present influence of the mighty entity who has done his work and kept his guard there for so many thousands of years. Sacred rivers. There are sacred rivers also, the Ganges, for example. The idea is that some great person of old has magnetized the source of the river with such power that all the water that henceforth flows out from that source is in a true sense holy water, bearing with it his influence and his blessing. This is not an impossibility, though it would require either a great reserve of power in the beginning or some arrangement for a frequent repetition. The process is simple and comprehensible. The only difficulty is what may be called the size of the operation. But what would be beyond the power of the ordinary man might possibly be quite easy to someone at a much higher level. Chapter 8. By ceremonies. In considering the influence exerted by our cathedrals and churches we have hitherto concerned ourselves with that which radiates from their walls. That is, however, only one small part of the effect that they are intended to produce upon the community, only incidental to the great plan of the founder of the religion, and even that plan in turn is only part of a still mightier scheme. Let me try to explain. The hierarchy. Theosophical students are familiar with the fact that the direction of the evolution of the world is vested in the hierarchy of adepts, working under one great leader. And that one of the departments of this government is devoted to the promotion and management of religion. The official in charge of that department is called in the East the Bodhisattva, and is known to us in the West as the Christ, though that is really the title of only one of his incarnations. The plan of the government is that during each world period there shall be 7 successive Christs, one for each root race. Each of these in succession holds this office of Bodhisattva, and during his term of office he is in charge of all the religious thought of the world, not only of that of his own special root race, and he may incarnate many times. To illustrate exactly what is meant, Let us take the case of the previous holder of this office, whom we know as the Lord Gautama. He was technically the Bodhisattva of the Atlantean or fourth root race, and in that he incarnated many times under different names through a period spreading over several hundreds of thousands of years. But though his special work thus lay with the fourth root race, he was in charge of the religions of the whole world, and consequently he did not neglect the fifth root race. In the earlier part of the history of each of its subraces he appeared and founded a special religion. In the first subrace he was the original Vyasa. The name which he bore in the second subrace has not been preserved in history. In the third subrace he was the original Zoroaster, the first of a long line who bore that name. For the great religion of Egypt he was Thoth, called by the Greeks Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice greatest, and among the early Greeks of the fourth subrace he was Orpheus the bard, the founder of their mysteries. In each of such births he drew round him a number of earnest disciples, naturally in many cases the same egos over again in new bodies, although he was steadily adding to their number. The fourth root race has by no means finished its evolution, for the majority of the Earth's inhabitants still belong to it, the vast hosts of Chinese, Tartars, Japanese, Malays and all the undeveloped peoples of the earth. But it has long passed its prime, the time when it was the dominant race of the world, and when all the most advanced egos were incarnated in it. When the glory had finally passed from it, the Bodhisattva prepared for the culminating act of his work, which involves for him the attainment of that very high level of initiation which we call the Buddhahood, and also the resigning of his office into the hands of his successor. The preparation required was to bring together into one country, and even to a great extent into part of that country, all the egos who had been his special followers in the different lives which lay behind him. Then he himself incarnated among them, or perhaps more probably one of his highest disciples incarnated among them, and yielded up his body to the Bodhisattva when the appointed time drew near. And as soon as in that body he had taken the great initiation and become the Buddha, he went forth to preach his law. We must not attach to that word law the ordinary English meaning, for it goes very much further than a mere set of commands. We must take it rather to signify his presentation of the truth about humanity and its evolution, and his instructions, based upon that truth, as to how a man should act so as to cooperate in the scheme of that evolution. Preaching this law he drew round him all the hosts of his old disciples, and by the tremendous power and magnetism which belonged to him as the Buddha he enabled large numbers of them to take that fourth step on the path, to which is given the name of the Arhat. He spent the rest of his life on earth in preaching and consolidating this new faith, and when he passed away from physical life he definitely handed over his office of director of religion to his successor, whom we call the Lord Maitreya, the Great One, who is honored all through India under the name of Krishna and throughout the Christian world as Jesus the Christ. No theosophical student will be confused by this last expression, for he knows that the Christ, who is the new Bodhisattva, took the body of the disciple Jesus, and held it for the last 3 years of its life in order to found the Christian religion. After its death he continued for some years to teach his more immediate disciples from the astral world. And from that time to this he has employed that disciple Jesus, now himself a master, to watch over and guide as far as may be the destinies of his church. Immediately upon taking over the office, the Lord Maitreya availed himself of the extraordinarily good conditions left behind him by the Buddha to make several simultaneous attempts to promote the religious progress of the world. He not only descended into an almost immediate incarnation himself, but he at the same time employed a number of those who had attained the Arhat level under the Lord Buddha, and were now ready to take rebirth at once. From this band of disciples came those whom we call Lao Tse and Confucius, who were sent to incarnate in China. From them also came Plato, and from among their followers Phidias and many another of the greatest of the Greeks. Within the same area of time came the great philosopher Pythagoras, who is now our master K.H. He was not one of the immediate attendants of the Lord Buddha, as he had already attained the Arhat level and was needed for work elsewhere, but he traveled over to India to see him and to receive his blessing. He also is upon the line of the Bodhisattva, and may be regarded as one of his foremost lieutenants. Simultaneously with all these efforts the Lord Maitreya himself incarnated as Krishna, and led in India a very wonderful life, upon which is founded the devotional aspect of the religion of that country. which shows us perhaps the most fervent examples of utter devotion to be seen anywhere in the world. This great incarnation must not be confounded with that of the Krishna described in the Mahabharata. The latter was a warrior and a statesman, and lived some 2,500 years before the time of which we are speaking. Along with this came another great incarnation, not this time from the department of religion, but rather from one of the departments of organization, the great Shankaracharya, who traveled over India, founding the 4 chief monasteries and the sannyasi order. Some confusion has been created by the fact that each of the long line of those who have since stood at the head of the monastic organizations has also taken the title of Shankaracharya. So that to speak of Shankaracharya is like speaking of the Pope without indicating which particular holder of the papal chair is intended. The great founder to whom we have referred must not be confused with the better-known holder of the office who some 700 years after Christ wrote a voluminous series of commentaries on the Bhagavad Gita and some of the Upanishads. The 3 paths. These 3 great teachers, who followed one another so quickly in India, furnished between them a fresh impulse along each of the 3 paths. The Buddha founded a religion giving minute directions for daily life, such as would be needed by those who should follow the path of action, while Shankaracharya provided the metaphysical teaching for those to whom the path is wisdom. And the Lord Maitreya, manifesting as Krishna, provided a supreme object of devotion for those to whom that is the most direct road to the truth. But Christianity must be considered as the first effort of the new Bodhisattva to build a religion which should go abroad into new countries, for his work as Krishna had been intended especially for India. For those who penetrate behind the external manifestation to the inner and mystical meaning, it will be significant that the ray or type to which belong the Lord Buddha, the Bodhisattva and our Master K.H. is in a special sense a manifestation of the second aspect of the solar deity, the second person of the Blessed Trinity. Religion has an objective side to it. It acts not only from within by stirring up the hearts and minds